Chapter 12 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The phone rang. "Mr. Tompkins?" a girl's voice inquired. "Just a moment. Mr. Willamer of the Securities and Exchange Commission will speak to you." I didn't like that will. "And who the hell, Arthurjean, is Mr. Willamer of the SEC?" I asked in an aside. "The Wikes," she said. "Hello, Tompkins," a clear, photogenic baritone inquired. "This is Harry Willamer. I saw your list of selling orders this morning and wondered if you could drop in and see me." "Certainly," I said. "Shall I bring my books?" "Not necessary. This is entirely informal. As a matter of fact, I have some gentlemen from Washington whom I think you will be interested in meeting. This is entirely unofficial, of course." "How about meeting me at the Pond Club at 1 o'clock?" "That will be grand," Mr. Willamer answered heartily. "The Pond Club at 1 o'clock it is." I turned to Arthurjean. "What kind of go-round is this? I start selling and inside an hour the SEC is on my tail? Isn't speculation legal anymore?" "Baby," she remarked, "anything's legal as long as you're in with the right guys. All I can tell you is that Willamer is hot stuff. His aunt is a cousin of Jesse Jones, or maybe it's Henry Morgenthau. So you watch yourself and don't do any talking out of turn." It was Tuesday the 10th, and I had launched my plan of selling the war short in a determined campaign to unload GM and US Steel. I was well covered in case of a rise, but there was already $1 million of the firm's money in the operation, behind the Finch million, which I had used to break the ice. The Pond Club was the same as ever. Tammy was polishing the glasses in his little bar, and there were no fellow members in evidence. After all, I decided, they weren't likely to show up much before 3 o'clock. However, I decided that privacy was called for, especially if Commander Tolan put in an appearance. "Tammy," I explained, as he produced his usual pick-me-up and waited for me to down it, "I'm expecting some gentlemen to join me in a few minutes. Is there a room where we could have a private conversation and still get something to drink?" "Well, Mr. Tompkins, I think I could let you use the Minnow Room. That's private and there's a dumbwaiter to the bar. Just push the buzzer and say what you want in the phone and I'll send it right up to you." "That sounds like perfection," I told him. "I'll go on up to the Minnow Room. The gentleman I'm expecting is named Willamer, and he'll have some friends with him. Just send them up when they arrive." "How do you get there?" Tammy looked a trifle startled. "That's where you had your bachelor dinner, sir." He reproved me. "Up the stairs and first door to your left, sir. You'll remember it when you see it, I'm quite sure." Tammy was right. No one who had ever seen the Pond Club's Minnow Room was likely to forget it. The wall on one side was lined solid with illuminated tanks containing goldfish making fishy little zeros with their stupid mouths. The other walls were enlivened by frescoes of drunken fish in various hilarious attitudes. Indirect lighting gave a sort of black mass or diabolical fish fry effect to the whole. It was definitely not a room to stay sober in. "Tompkins?" The door opened and an egg-smooth young man with a baldish head and pale eyebrows stood in the entrance. "I'm Harry Willamer. Meet the rest of the gang. Here's Winston Sales of the War Production Board, Lieutenant Colonel George Finnegan of the Army Quartermaster Corps, and Commander Raymond Coonley of the Navy Bureau of Supplies." Except for the uniforms, they might have been cousins. They were all fattish, baldish, and blondish. They were all egg-like men, middle-aged, all hearty in manner, and all seemed to have no particular reason for existing. "Well, gentlemen," I asked, "what will you have to drink?" "Scotch and soda," said Willamer. "Hell, let's make it scotch for everyone and save trouble." "I'd like a whiskey sour," objected Commander Coonley. "I've got butterflies in my stomach after working with those hotshots from Detroit last night." "Okay," Willamer accepted the amendment. "One whiskey sour. Any other changes?" There were none, so I signaled to Tammy and our order was filled. "Tompkins," Willamer remarked, "you'll excuse this short notice, but when I spotted your selling orders in the market this morning, I knew we had to move fast. First of all, I'd like to know why you are selling when everybody else is buying." "Mr. Willamer, I explained. It's none of the SEC's goddamn business what or why I sell, so long as I follow the regulations. Willimer laughed. "Oh, who said anything about the SEC?" he demanded. "Oh, I get it. You thought this was an informal investigation by the Commission, right? My fault. Should have told you that this has nothing to do with your firm's market position or the SEC. I took a reflective swallow of scotch. Then what the hell is this? I asked. Harry Willimer drew himself up. We, he explained, are the Inter Alia Trading Corporation. Your selling order suggests that you don't expect the war to last much longer. I don't, I told him. Neither do we, Willimer continued. That's why we've been busy organizing Inter Alia. It's a neat setup. Sales here, on the War Production Board, is in a position to advise us of all cutbacks in war contracts and keep in touch with the whole contract termination program. Colonel Finnegan is in the Quartermaster Corps and is the only one in the Army. In the world, Harry, Finnegan corrected him. Right you are, George, in the world. Who knows where all the surplus war stocks are located? His office routes them to the depots. That in itself is worth $1 million to the company. Anything from jeeps to nylons, Colonel Finnegan knows where they are and what price will buy them. Commander Coonley is in the same position on Navy supplies. Between him and Finnegan, there isn't an ounce of anything from parachute silk to bulldozers which we can't locate. As for me, I watch the way money and markets move here in Wall Street. I finished my drink. That sounds wonderful, Mr. Willimer, but what has it got to do with me? You have the makings of a $10 million corporation between the four of you. Willimer raised a soft, white, well-manicured hand in a traffic-stopping gesture. All but one thing, Tompkins, he said. We haven't got working capital to exploit this setup. That's where you come in. Tompkins, Wasson & Cohn controls between $3 and $5 million and are smart operators. So long as you stuck to conservative methods, no dice for Inter Alia. But when I saw you gambling on the early end of the war, I said to myself, this is where we can do business with Tompkins. How much do you need? I asked. 300,000 would be enough to start with, Willimer reckoned. 500,000, Finnegan amended. Say you need 500,000 to start with, and I put it up. What do I get out of it? I demanded. Willimer looked a little secretive. Well, Tompkins, he admitted, you'll get good security for your money, of course, and a share in what we make. Say a fifth, since there are 4 of us in it already. That sounds reasonable, I agreed. Assuming you have a sure thing. What's your first operation once you get the money in Inter Alia to finance it? Willimer looked still more secretive. That is a firm secret, Tompkins, he told me. If you decide to come in with us, I'll let you in on our plans. But this thing is too big to talk about until we see the color of your money. I stood up. Well then, gentlemen, I announced, will you have one more round of drinks and then kindly get the hell out of here? I'm delighted to have met you personally, but I don't see the point of wasting our time unless I know what I am putting my money into. Tell him, Harry, Sales urged. We can trust Tompkins not to take advantage of our plans. The way we're set up, we could block him easy if he tried to double-cross us. That's right, I said. It's your plan, and you have the inside track. Well then, Willimer explained, here's our first operation. The Army and Navy have huge stocks of atabrine and quinine left over from Africa and the Southwest Pacific. As soon as the fighting stops, Colonel Finnegan and Commander Coonley will declare these stocks surplus to be sold at spot sales where they are. We will be the only bidders, and we get a world corner on malaria. The whole world needs that stuff, and if we move fast during the confusion after victory, we can sew it up and make the world pay our price. We ought to double our money in 3 months. Double? Snorted Sales. We ought to quintuple it, like Papa Dion. South America is just lousy with dollars, and here's a way to get them back home. Malaria is a big item down there. No quinine, no oil. Well, gentlemen, I told the Inter Alia boys. I'll have to think it over. As Mr. Willimer knows, I'm pretty heavily committed in the present market. Get in touch with me about the end of the month, and I might be able to put, say, $20,000 into your proposition. Willimer smiled unpleasantly. Come, Tompkins, he said. You can do much better than that. Perhaps you don't realize that the SEC might just decide to investigate your firm's market position. You can afford to put in at least $100,000 now, and when you get out of your present operation, make up the balance of that $500,000. I went to the dumbwaiter and pushed the buzzer. Tammy, I spoke into the phone, will you come up here and show these gentlemen out of the club? We've finished our talk. Nothing doing, I said to the others. I don't shake down well. Willimer blinked his watery blue eyes at me. That's libelous, he stated. I'm a lawyer and I ought to know. You can't accuse me of blackmail in the presence of witnesses. By God, Tompkins, I'll have the examiners in your office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I'll sue you for damages. Oh, no, you won't, I informed him. I didn't call you a blackmailer, and I doubt that your friends will care to testify. You didn't know, or perhaps I forgot to mention it, but this room is wired for dictaphones, and a complete phonographic record of this conversation is already on wire. I'll send it over to the FBI in the morning, unless you... Excuse me, Harry, said Commander Coonley with an air of decision. I didn't hear any reference to blackmail by Mr. Tompkins. I'd better be getting back to my office. Me too, chimed Lieutenant Colonel George Finnegan. Nice to have met you, Tompkins, Winston Sales observed as he strode briskly for the exit. Harry Willimer turned to me, not without dignity. You son of a bitch, he remarked feelingly, and followed the others. I waited until it was reasonably sure that the Inter Alia group had left the building. Then I went downstairs to the bar and found Tammy alone. Tammy, I said, you overheard our conversation down the dummy, didn't you? Oh, no, sir, not at all, Mr. Tompkins. Of course you did, Tammy. You heard these gentlemen try to blackmail me, and you heard me tell them to go to hell, didn't you? I languidly waved a $20 bill under his snubby nose. Now that you put it that way, sir, the little bar steward admitted. I do remember hearing that Mr. Willimer say that unless you gave him $100,000, he'd start investigating your books. Splendid, I congratulated him. Just remember that when the time comes. Now see if you can get me Mr. Merriweather Vail on the phone. He's in the Manhattan Directory, a lawyer. Mary, I asked after we had been connected, I have a feeling I'm going to need your legal services. No, it's not that one. It's another kind of jam. I'm being blackmailed. No, you dope, it's not a woman. It's an official. Yes, I'll stick here until you can get over. What shall I order for you? A double scotch? Right, at the Pond Club. There was one more move to make. I called Bedford Hills person-to-person call and asked for my wife. After the usual duel between local and suburban operators, Jimmy's voice answered. Winnie, she said, thank goodness you telephoned me. You'd better come at once. The most dreadful things have been happening. It's not so wonderful here either, I told her. Listen, Jimmy, you come on in. It's Ponto, she said, paying absolutely no attention to what I was saying. He's drunk. Yes, drunk. He managed to upset that decanter of old brandy you keep on your night table and lapped it up. Now he's howling and hiccuping like mad, and I'm afraid to go near him. Oh, Jimmy, to hell with Ponto. Let him sleep it off. You come on into town. We've got to do some fast thinking. I'll meet you in the little bar at the Ritz at 5 o'clock. Bring your night things, and mine too. We may have to leave town in a hurry. I'll explain when I see you. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mary Vail listened to my account of the encounter with the Inter Alia gang and then rolled his eyes toward heaven. Poor old Winnie, he expostulated. Why didn't you try something comparatively safe, like robbing a she-bear of her whelps, or yelling hooray for Hitler in Union Square? Harry Willimer is a vindictive guy, and his aunt or his mother-in-law is related to Jesse Jones. At least that's what the street believes. What can he do to me? I asked. I have him cold on a charge of blackmail. Like hell you do, said Mary. First thing he'll check with the FBI to find if there is a recording of your talk, and there isn't. So it's your word and Tammy's against that of 4 high-ranking government officials. You ask what they can do to you? You just call Phil Cohn at your office and see if they haven't started doing it already. The steward made the phone connection, and in a few minutes Cohn's languid voice was complaining over the wire. Say, Winnie, what the hell have you been up to? Nothing, Phil. Why? I asked. It's just that the word's been passed to lay off Tompkins, Wasson, and Cohn. The brokers don't want to handle our orders. You know Manny Oppenheimer of Auchincloss, Morton, Caton, Beauregard, and Oppenheimer? You know how he used to lick your boots if you stood still long enough for him to kneel down and stick his tongue out? Well, Manny cut me. Yeah, that's right, cut me. What's cooking? Even my best friends won't tell me whether it's B.O. or dishpan hands. Just keep on plugging, Phil, I urged. They can't refuse to handle our orders if we insist. I'll put in some calls on this. Yeah, I'm up at the Pond Club with my attorney. I'll try to call you back. That guy Willimer is back of this, because I wouldn't go along with his proposition. Uh-oh, Phil observed dismally. That's enough for me. Think I'd better join the Marines? You keep away from the recruiting sergeant until we finish this operation, I told him. I turned to Vale. Mary, I said, this is one for you to handle. Brokers are trying to get out of handling our orders, and 10th raters like Manny Oppenheimer are high-hatting Phil Cohn. You put in a call and find out what it's all about. Vale meditated. Okay, he said at last. You understand I'm acting as your attorney now? Sure, I agreed. He dialed the number. I'd like to speak to the U.S. Attorney's Office, he told the switchboard operator. Yes, I'll wait. Yes. Oh, Ned, this is Mary Vale. I've been retained by Winfred Tompkins. What I want to know is whether there are any charges against him. Yeah, he's with me now. No, he won't try to leave town. Suspicion of kidnapping? No fooling. That's cockeyed. Listen, counselor. My client is innocent and stands ready to answer all charges. He turned to me. Hell, he hung up. What was that about kidnapping? I asked. Oh, something completely screwball, my attorney said. It's only that his office has received an anonymous charge accusing you of having kidnapped Winnie Tompkins and masquerading in his place. Ned also told me you were in trouble with other government agencies and said he'd see me in court. Damn, I objected. That sounds like Virginia Rutherford's idea of a snappy way to find out where I was before Easter. It doesn't make any sense. If I kidnap Tompkins, who am I supposed to be? I'm ready to take a fingerprint test any time, even with these bandages on my right hand. Vale clucked his tongue. That attitude won't help, he said. If you don't look out, they'll say your prints prove that you're the man who kidnapped Charlie Ross. No, Ned is full of prunes and he doesn't put much stock in this kidnapping angle. But the wolves are after you all right. Now I've passed the word. You can't leave the state, of course. Damn you, Mary, I objected. I never told you. You retained me, Winnie. That's enough. You'd be a damn fool to pull out now. Every G-man in America would be after you. My advice is to stick around. Today's the 11th, Wednesday. Well, you have a weekend coming up, so you might just as well go on commuting between your office and Bedford Hills as be pulled off the fast freight at Oneonta. Damn that Rutherford woman, I remarked. She's the one who turned me into the district attorney. Up to now, I've just had a few friendly passes from a nice guy from the FBI. I can't advise you on the subject of your sex life, Vale said. But you have nothing to fear if you remember to cultivate a clean-cut, manly expression and an air of amazed innocence as you tell the judge, Not guilty, Your Honor, and I reserve my defense. What shall I tell Phil Cone, though? I asked. Wait a minute and I'll put in another call, Vail said. He dialed another number. I want to speak to Joe, he said. Yes, Joe. Tell him it's Mary Vail. Joe, this is Mary. Same to you. Say, what's all this BS about Winnie Tompkins? Oh, the hell you say? I don't believe... No, that's definitely not true. If it was anybody but you, Joe, I'd advise him to sue for libel. Yeah, he's my client. Of course he's innocent. Lay you 5 to 1 in thousands he is. Done. Vail turned back to me. That was the chief fixer in New York, he told me. His word is good. This kidnapping charge is a phony, just a move to tie you up. What they think they have on you is a charge under the Espionage Act, communicating with the enemy. Joe was vague, but it sounded plenty tough. The SEC's passed out word to be cagey in trading with you. They can't blacklist you or freeze your funds without a hearing, but they sure can put on the heat. How much did Willimer want you to put into his racket? $500,000, I told him. 100,000 now, and the rest in 30 days. Mary Vail drew a wry face, sucked in his lips, and signaled to Tammy for another drink. As a member of the bar and an officer of the court, he remarked, I can't advise you to pay blackmail. On the other hand, if you could see your way to making a substantial investment in the Inter Alia Corporation, it might make things much pleasanter all around. I shook my head. No, Mary, I told him, and you were through as my attorney. I'll take my chances without a lawyer from now on, if that's the sort of advice I pay you for. I don't mind a gamble, but these boys figure to use malaria to put a financial squeeze on the whole world. Ever see a man die of malignant malaria, Mary? It's not nice, and it's not necessary, if you have Atabrine or quinine. No, damn it, you go peddle your papers, and I'll fight this one alone. Tammy, I added, get me the office, please. I want to talk to Mr. Cone again. Vail grinned and clapped me on the shoulder. Like hell you'll do without an attorney, you damn fool, he said. I'm sticking with you, with or without a fee. Say, he added, what's come into you to make you act this way? You used to get the heebie-jeebies at the mere thought of legal complications. Phil, I said into the phone, this is Winnie. Things are plenty bad for me personally. You and Graham can pull right out now if you wish. That louse Harry Willimer or somebody has put me on the spot, and I'm trying to prove I'm not a Nazi agent. No, neither are you, but you might have a hell of a time proving it. That's swell of you, Phil, but I don't want to get you or Graham in trouble. Now's the time to pull out of the firm if you like. Naturally, I'm innocent, but just now it's tough. Okay, you take it up with Graham, will you? I don't want to have to worry about either of you. Sure, I'm in a jam, but it's not your fault and has nothing to do with the firm. When I put the telephone back in its cradle, I looked up to see Mary Vail staring at me. Winnie, he said, you're innocent for my money. Fun's fun, but this thing is dangerous. Now, I'm your attorney, and you'll sure as hell need one, so it's no use firing me. I don't know what sort of a frame they figured for you, or why the FBI... I laughed. Okay, Mary, I told him. You're still my attorney. The FBI's been swell. The special agent assigned to check up on me, A.J. Harcourt, couldn't be nicer. I'd trust him not to pull a fast one. Vail frowned. The FBI may be swell, he answered, but their hand can be forced. They have to act on information received and superior orders. Your man Harcourt may be the nicest guy in the world, but if he's told to bring you in, he'll bring you in. Then what's your advice, counselor? My advice to you, Winnie, he said, is to try to forget about it. Just go right ahead with your plans, whatever they are, just so you don't try to leave this jurisdiction or go into hiding. The best thing you could do is to go back to Bedford Hills and mind your own business, and don't let these government so-and-sos push you around. Hell, this is a free country. But I phoned Jimmy to meet me at the Ritz at 5 o'clock, I objected, with our traveling things. Vail glanced at his wristwatch. It's not 3 yet. If you phone her now, the chances are she hasn't left. Tell her to stay put. Remember, the less you act guilty or scared, the safer you are. The dog doesn't start to chase the rabbit until the rabbit starts to run. I phoned back to Pook's Hill and was rewarded by catching Jimmy 5 minutes before the taxi was due to pick her up. Hold everything, dear, I told her. Plans have changed. I'm coming out on the first train I can catch. How's Ponto? Thank heaven you called, Winnie's wife replied. I couldn't find your dressing gown. And your traveling case is in the room with Ponto, and I didn't want to disturb him. Oh, he's snoring like mad. Passed out cold, I guess. He shakes the house. I never knew dogs got drunk. Did you? When I first arrived at Pook's Hill, I had a definite program in mind. First, I went to the kitchen, broke a raw egg into a tumbler, and soused it in Worcestershire sauce. Then I added a good slug of brandy from the portable bar in my den. Armed with this prairie oyster, I went boldly to the second floor, opened the door to my bedroom, and contemplated the debauched Great Dane. Really, I could never have believed that a dog could look so completely blotto. Ponto was a bum in every sense of the word. He lay drooling and snoring on the bed, dead to the world. Ponto, I ordered. An ear pricked up, then dropped languidly back again. Then a bloodshot eye opened and shut. There was a half whine, half snarl, interrupted by a violent hiccup. Here you are, Ponto, I stated firmly, advancing on the bed, glass in hand. The bloodshot eye opened again, and the beast began to shake and shiver. I walked up, lifted his jowl in one hand, made a little funnel of his lip, and poured in the prairie oyster. Then I clamped a firm control on the jaws, held Ponto's head back, and let it slide gulping down his gullet. Ponto heaved. He shuddered. He shook himself free, leaped from the bed, and ran around the room, lurching, whining, and shaking his head violently. He stopped and sideswiped his muzzle with a clumsy paw. He laid down on his back and rolled. Then the dose took hold. A noble expression seemed to pour over his brow. His eyes opened wide and remained open, with a clear and friendly gleam. He stood up, shook himself, ran into the bathroom, gulped some water from his bowl very noisily, and then came bounding back. Woof, he said to me. Then Ponto reared on his hind legs, placed 2 large paws on my shoulders, and proceeded to lick my face thoroughly with a rough, wet tongue. I had made a friend, I decided. As Androcles had won the lion by removing the thorn from its paw, so had I tamed Ponto by administering first aid. There was a tap at the door. It was Jimmy. Are you all right, Winnie? She asked. Is he still asleep? Asleep? I was contemptuous. No, he's awake. Ponto and I are pals. We understand each other. He had a hangover, and I fixed him. We're buddies now, aren't we, old fellow? The answer was a low, savage growl, and I leaped through the door barely in time to escape his earnest but rather shaky attempt to remove a couple pounds of meat from my exterior. Hell, I explained. That beast's not human. Let's send him back to the vets and get something easier to live with, a Yorkshire or a poodle. I'd like a Chihuahua, said Germaine, or one of those little Belgian Schipperke gadgets. How about a collie? I asked. Germaine raised piteous eyes to me. Do you want to make me ill with your talk of collies? She asked. Now, come on down to the den and tell me what's been going on in town. Well, Jimmy, I began, it's a long, long story. End of chapter 13. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. If it's going to be long, she said, we'd both better have a drink. You always think better if you have a glass in your hand. Now, what is it you want to know? I answered. after we were comfortably settled in front of the electric fire. It's just that everything is so queer, Germaine began. You've changed so that you almost seem like a different person. You even look better, not so flabby, as though you took regular exercise. At least I see a change. And then suddenly I find that you've been carrying on with that Briggs girl, and I can't tell whether you've really changed or are just trying to fool me. She's a nice person, of course, and if you must have another girl, I'd rather have you pick someone, safe and comfortable like her. But you said you hadn't been playing with the office girls. And then there's Ponto. He used to adore you, and you swore by him. Now he tries to bite you, and you want to get rid of him. And then there's all this talk about where you were during Holy Week, and that FBI man, and Myrtle tells me they've been asking a lot of questions about you in Virginia. What have you been doing, dear, that you can't remember when our whole life may depend on it? Jimmy, I told her, I wish to God I knew. You must believe me when I tell you I can't remember things before Easter Monday. That was the 2nd, and today's the 11th. And I can remember everything that's happened since then. Before that, it is all blank and all mixed up in that dream I had. She moved away from me slightly. You can't tell me that the FBI would be interested in your dreams, she said sharply. Not in time of war. They are in this dream, I told her. You see, I dreamed, if you want to call it that a certain American ship blew up in the North Pacific. The trouble is that the public hasn't been told there is such a ship, like that old Nameless in the Solomons, and that the Navy Department doesn't know what happened to it. I believe that it did blow up. Harcourt believes my story, in the main, but from the FBI angle, they have to check up on whether I'm not part of an Axis spy ring which could have caused the explosion. If I could only remember where I was and what I was doing the week before, I could clear myself. Her face lighted and she relaxed. Oh, is that all? She exclaimed. I know you couldn't have done anything like that. All you've probably been doing is to go off with one of those silly girls of yours to some out-of-the-way place. That ought to be easy to check, even if you registered under a false name. For the first time, you know, she added, I'm almost glad you've been chasing all those stupid blondes of yours. It will make it easy to establish your alias. Alibi, I corrected her. Let me fix you another drink. From now on, I added, there are going to be no more blondes or redheads. I like Arthur Jean Briggs. She's named Arthur Jean for her father and mother. It's one word, like Mary Lou or Honeychild. But she's more like a friend than you know. You saw her. But I guess you're right. I must have been chasing around so much, my mind got tangled up in itself and sort of blew a fuse. If I can't get my memory straightened out soon, I'll look up a psychiatrist and see if he can't fix me. You know, Winnie, Germaine began and then fell silent. Yes, Jimmy? She turned towards me and smiled rather wistfully. You know, I was going to say that you and I, perhaps, well, it's so long since we've been really, close to each other. I wondered... You mean that perhaps we ought to patch things up between us? Isn't that what a wife's for? She asked. I mean, when things get difficult, there ought to be one person to whom you could turn. I slipped my arm around her and drew her close to me on the lounge. She lowered her face against my coat, and I could feel her shaking. You're crying, I said. You mustn't cry. Oh, Winnie, I've been so alone, so... I raised her face to mine and kissed her, tasting the wet salt tears. Her lips were warm and soft against mine. Suddenly she pressed herself against me and responded to my kiss so fiercely that we were both startled. We sprang apart, almost guiltily. Oh, she exclaimed. Oh, you haven't kissed me like that. She raised her lips again, and this time we held it. What with one thing and another, I didn't get back to the office until the market closed on Thursday afternoon. I found my two partners in pretty good control of our operations, but frankly mystified as to the cause of the official mugging of Tompkins, Wasson, and Cohn. We had laid out $2.5 million in all, despite the attempt to scare us off. The market had continued steady. Neither Graham nor Phil asked me any direct questions about the events on Wednesday. They talked straight business and kept their curiosity in check. It was close to 4:30 when we finished our general discussion of the operation, so I decided that they were entitled to some kind of explanation in return for their loyalty. "See here, boys," I told them. "You've both been perfectly swell about this rat race the SEC started. Harry Willimer tried to put the squeeze on me for $500,000 to finance him and a bunch of official bastards in a shady deal. When I turned him down, he threatened to tie us up with a commission investigation. I bluffed him out of it at the time by pretending there was an FBI dictaphone record of our talk, so he laid off the heavy heat and just started needling us a little. Any time now, he'll make the check at the FBI, and when he finds there isn't any record, he'll try to tie us up tighter than a drum. All we can do is wait it out. The market's going to start dropping any day now, and we'll clean up." "Oh," Wasson said. "Was that it? Willimer's a bad actor. Thanks for telling us, Winnie. Phil and I knew that there must be something screwy when..." The door flew open and Arthurjean appeared, her face white. "God," she said at last. "He was such a swell guy. He..." "Who? What's the "It's Roosevelt," she choked. "He's dead. It just came in on the ticker." "No!" "He died at Warm Springs." And she hid her face in her hands and left the room sobbing. Phil Cohn stood up, paper white, crossed over, and turned up the radio. "Flash," the announcer was saying. "Warm Springs, Georgia. President Roosevelt died this afternoon following his collapse from a severe cerebral hemorrhage. More in a moment. Keep tuned to this station." "Well, I'll be eternally damned," I said. "So he was right." Cohn whirled on me. "You knew about this," he stated flatly. "When we were talking yesterday morning. You had more than a hunch. You knew he was going to die." "Be your age, Phil," I told him. "How in hell could I know?" "Jesus Christ," Wasson growled. "This will knock holy hell out of the market. Lucky Trading's closed for the day. They can't open tomorrow. They'll have to shut down all the exchanges. They'll have to close the banks. God, what a mess." Cohn still looked dazed. "No dancing in the streets?" he asked bitterly. "I thought this was going to send values skyrocketing." Wasson swung on him. "The hell with that talk, Phil," he snapped. "I was just shooting the bull. Roosevelt dead. Jesus H. Christ. You know, he wasn't a bad old buzzard after he got rid of all that New Deal nonsense and set to work winning this war." Cohn had recovered his poise. "Sure, he did a swell job winning the war, but now we're going to lose the peace, sure as shooting." "Hell!" Graham's choice of expletives was strictly rationed. "This means that Truman will take over. What sort of guy is he? You got any idea, Winnie? He's not up to Roosevelt, that's sure." I shook my head. "I don't know from nothing," I began. "Shh!" The radio announcer resumed his broadcast. "Warm Springs, Georgia. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away at 4:35 this afternoon, Eastern Wartime, following a severe cerebral hemorrhage. The late president had been spending a few days at his Georgia retreat, getting rested after his strenuous trip to the Yalta Conference. Earlier this afternoon, he complained of a severe headache and almost immediately became unconscious. He died peacefully a little later. His death came at a moment when American troops in Germany and on Okinawa were driving ahead toward the victory he..." Cohn switched it down again. "He had a headache," he muttered. "What do you think we're going to have?" The telephone rang. I picked up the instrument. It was one of those automatic phonograph recordings. The stock exchange will not be open tomorrow by order of the governors, out of respect for the memory of the late President Roosevelt. That is all. The stock exchange will not be open. The metallic feminine voice went on. I hung up. You're right about one thing, Graham, I said. That was an automatic message to say the exchange will be closed tomorrow. It's probably on the ticker, too. It was. Cone sat down suddenly, as though his legs had turned to rubber. Now it will all start again, he said. Sell out and pack up and clear out. I crossed the office and put my hand on his shoulder. Cheer up, Phil, I told him. It won't be as bad as that. Graham and I will stick with you. And that's true of Americans generally. Cone shrugged his shoulders hopelessly. Thanks, Winnie, he remarked. You're a good fellow and a good friend. I've got something to say to you. You won't like it. I got worried yesterday when you started talking about Roosevelt maybe dying, and I tipped the FBI on what you said. I laughed. If the FBI arrested every man in Wall Street who had ever talked about Roosevelt dying, the jails wouldn't hold them. Don't worry, Phil. In your shoes, I'd have done the same thing. The phone rang again. It was the receptionist. Mr. Harcourt is here to see you, Mr. Tompkins, she informed me. Shall I ask him to wait? Tell him I'll see him in a couple of minutes, I replied. This is it, boys, I told my partners. It's the FBI. Now, the market's going to drop. It will be a bear market in a big way. Dignified as hell, and we're in ahead of the others. You two just carry on. Try to get a line on this guy Truman. Some of our Kansas City correspondents may have the dope. Phil, no hard feelings about this FBI angle. They've been riding me for days on some crazy story Ranty Tolan started about me last week. Wasson looked at me coldly. If I thought that you had anything to do with this, he began. Oh, skip it, I begged him. You know me better. I picked up the phone and told the receptionist to send Harcourt in. Mr. Tompkins, he said, I've been ordered to ask you to come up to the Bureau's headquarters right away. Am I under arrest? I asked. Well, Harcourt admitted, I haven't got a warrant, but I think maybe you better come with me. What's the charge? My chief will tell you what it's all about, he said. My orders were to bring you in for questioning. Okay, I agreed. I'll come along quietly. Phil, will you tell Miss Briggs to ring up my wife and say I won't be home tonight and not to worry? I'll be all right. Harcourt came and laid his hand on my arm. Come along, then, he ordered gruffly. What about my lawyer? I inquired. Graham, will you phone Merry Vale and tell him I've been taken up to the FBI for questioning? Harcourt looked up at me. Is Merriweather Vale your lawyer? He asked. I wouldn't bother to call him. We picked him up, too. All your associates, outside of business and, pleasure, are being rounded up. The president's dead, Mr. Tompkins, and you're going to have to do some talking to my chief. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The events which brought me into the office of Edward Lamb, Deputy Director of the FBI, on Friday the 13th, had developed so rapidly that I could scarcely believe that less than 24 hours had passed since Harcourt had taken me into custody. We had gone to the federal courthouse in a taxicab, paid for by me, where I was placed alone in a room for 15 minutes. At the end of that period, I was informed that Washington had asked that I be sent down for direct interrogation at the Bureau. I was told that if I preferred, I could demand a formal warrant of arrest, but that Mr. Vale, who had been released with an apology, advised me to go, and that I could confirm it by telephone, which I did. I was told that there was still no formal charge against me, but they asked if I would let myself be fingerprinted. To this I agreed, and then sat back while arrangements were completed to fly me down to Washington from the LaGuardia Airport. Harcourt was to accompany me. That had been all. They allowed me to phone Germaine and tell her I was going to Washington, and invite her to join me there as soon as I could get hotel accommodations. The FBI put me up for the night in one of their Manhattan hideouts, an old house on East 80th Street, and in the morning Harcourt and I had taken the plane. The clock had barely touched noon when I was told that Mr. Lamb was ready to see me. Lamb was a pleasant, youngish man, with that inevitable faint Hoover chubbiness, whose roomy office, with its deep leather easy chairs, spelled power in the FBI. I was amused to note that he followed Rule 1 of whistle-stop detection by seating me in a deep chair facing the light, while he sat at his desk on a definitely higher level and with the light behind him. "Well, Mr. Tompkins," he began, "we've had disturbing reports about you from at least 3 different sources. Frankly, we still don't know what to make of them, and the director thought it would be better if you came here and talked to us." "Always glad to help. If you tell me what the reports are, I'll try to explain." Lamb glanced at a file of papers on his desk. "The first one is an allegation that you aren't Winfred S. Tompkins, but an imposter who has kidnapped Tompkins and taken his place. That report was anonymous, and we don't attach any particular importance to it, although, if necessary, we could use it to detain you for questioning under the Lindbergh Law." I stretched out my hands towards him. "My fingerprints were taken last night," I said. "They ought to settle that question." Lamb laughed. "Unfortunately," he admitted, "it takes a little time to establish identity by fingerprints. The first tentative identification suggested by yours was a man named Jonas Lee. He is a Negro currently employed in the Charleston Navy Yard. However, I think we can assume that the final identification will bear you out. They're working on it now." There was a buzz and he picked up the desk telephone. "Oh, they do," he remarked. "Good." He turned back to me. "That was the fingerprint division. They're your prints all right, so we'll cancel the kidnapping charge." "What's the second strike on me?" "That's a report phoned in by one of your partners that you seemed to expect President Roosevelt's death 2 or 3 days before it happened." "I did," I explained. "A man named Axel Roscommon came to my office, said that he was the chief Nazi agent in the United States, and told me that Roosevelt had been poisoned at Yalta. I had already reported Roscommon to the Bureau and was told to let him alone. Roscommon said that only a few people, including Roosevelt, knew about the poisoning. I wanted to pass on the warning, but was told that it was too late, that I would simply expose myself to suspicion. So what I did was to make normal business preparations to take advantage of its effect on the stock market." Lamb looked up at the ceiling and remained silent for a few minutes. "So that's the way it was," he said. "For your personal information, Mr. Tompkins, Roscommon told the director the same thing a month ago, but when Mr. Hoover tried to warn the Secret Service, he had his ears slapped back. If I'd known about the Roscommon angle in your case, I would have told the New York office not to worry. I thought perhaps that this was another angle on the same story." "Do you believe that President Roosevelt was assassinated, Mr. Lamb?" I asked, point blank. He shrugged his shoulders. "No, I do not," he replied. "Not officially, that is. It is not inconceivable, and the Secret Service is so set in its ideas and methods that, well, frankly, I'd rather not believe it. I have no evidence, aside from a verbal warning, which might have been coincidence. Some of our toxicologists say that it could be done. Others deny that there is a virus which can produce the symptoms of a paralytic stroke. In any case, it's outside of our jurisdiction." I heaved a sigh of relief. "Thank God I'm clear of that one," I said. "I shouldn't like to be mixed up, even by accident, in anything like that. I remember what happened to Dr. Mudd." Lamb nodded. "The doctor who bandaged Booth's leg after the murder of Lincoln. Yes, I can see your point. How about the third charge? I asked. Lamb looked serious. That's not going to be so easy, Mr. Tompkins, he announced. Harcourt reports that he doesn't think there's anything to it, but Naval Intelligence has the jitters about this Alaska business. It seems to be pretty well established that on the afternoon of April 2nd, you stated that the USS Alaska had been sunk in an explosion off the Western Aleutians. That was over 10 days ago, and there is still no word from the carrier. The last report came from Attic, which had picked the ship up by radar on the 1st. The report given us was that you represented that it was all a dream. What worries the Navy about this explanation is that no public announcement had ever been made of the Alaska's launching or commission. She's a sneak carrier built under stringent security regulations, and until you came into the picture, the Navy was pretty sure that there had been no leak. I nodded dismally. Knowing the Navy, I replied, I can see how they feel. All that I can suggest, Mr. Lamb, is that this is a case of mental telepathy. There have been plenty of other instances of it on record. Often they call it intuition or second sight. I can only say that if you investigate and can find any other explanation, I'll be delighted. I don't think that Admiral Ballister, he's the present head of ONI, though they change so fast we almost lose count, will be satisfied with the theory that it is a case of ESP. That's extrasensory perception. And there have been plenty of scientific experiments in that field, but the Navy doesn't know about them. And then, of course, there was the bomb. I nodded. The thorium bomb, I began, and stopped as I noticed an official change in Lamb's attitude. Exactly, Mr. Tompkins, he observed. The thorium bomb. Nobody, at least outside of the President, the Secretary of the Navy, and Professor Chalmers, was supposed to know that there was such a thing as a thorium bomb. The security arrangements on the thorium project were so drastic. Roscommon knew all about it, I said. He also mentioned Chalmers to me. The deputy director looked slightly ill. He did he? He growled. That will teach the Navy not to let the Bureau handle domestic security. Hell, this thing gets bigger and bigger every minute. If Roscommon knew about it, then anybody could have known. Why, it's been an offense against the Espionage Act even to print the word thorium outside of chemical textbooks. And Chalmers is supposed to be in the TB sanitarium at Saranac. Wonder what happened to him. I leaned forward. He's dead, Mr. Lamb, I assured him. Everybody on the Alaska is dead. The bomb went off and there's nobody left to tell the tale. How do you do it, Tompkins? Lamb demanded. If you will give us the details and the names of your accomplices, I think I can promise you a life sentence instead of the electric chair. Mr. Lamb, I replied, you can promise till the cows come home. I, W.S. Tompkins, had no connection with it at all, and you can't prove that I had. I know about it only because of, well, call it mental telepathy. I could sit down and tell you exactly what happened on the Alaska before Chalmers deliberately touched off the bomb, but I couldn't prove it, and there isn't a living soul who could support or disprove my story. And if you place me under arrest, I'll be in a position to sue for heavy damages. False arrest on a charge of treason is no joke, and I'll fight. Lamb looked slightly uncomfortable. Well, he asked, what would you do if you were me? Let you go, with the Navy howling for action? There are two things I'd do, I told him. First of all, I'd assign a flock of agents to see if they can find out where I was and what I was doing between the 25th of March and the 2nd of April. Harcourt tells me that was the critical period. I don't remember. It's a case of amnesia, I guess. At any rate, I've drawn a blank. You have my fingerprints and photograph. You ought to be able to locate something. Lamb shook his head. That's not necessary now, he replied. If Roscommon knew about Chalmers and the bomb, the question of where you were the week before last isn't important anymore. We'd have to check back for at least 2 years. The other thing I'd do, I continued, would be to let me go under some sort of open arrest. Fix me up so I can see the intelligence people here and give me a chance to convince them that... I paused. Convince them of what? He asked tartly. See here, Mr. Lamb, I said. I'm in a hell of a personal jam. For personal reasons, I'm trying to clear things up. Believe it or not, this business about the sinking of the Alaska and the thorium bomb is the least of my troubles. I've got the damnedest case of loss of memory I've ever heard of. As Winfred S. Tompkins, I can only remember as far back as April 2nd. But I can remember years before that as somebody else. That's how I happen to know about the loss of the Alaska. How? He asked. According to your theory, everybody aboard her is dead. I nodded. Just the same, I was on the ship when she blew up. In my dream, I mean. If you give me a chance to talk to the intelligence heads, I think I can prove to their satisfaction not only that I know what I'm talking about, but that my knowledge is perfectly legitimate. Lamb grinned. The Bureau is in enough fights as it is without being accused of sending a screwball around to bother the heads of G2 and ONI. I leaned forward. I can see your point, I admitted. I know that in the Navy, everybody is out to cut everybody else's throat. It must be worse when two different government bureaus are involved. The deputy director looked at me. You seem to know a hell of a lot about the Navy for a stockbroker, he observed. At any rate, that idea's out. I won't give you introductions and... Okay, I agreed. Then let me try to do it my own way. I have some friends in the OSS. I'll see if they can get me in to see General Donovan. If I have a talk with him, perhaps he'll agree to pass me on to the others. Lamb laughed again. You don't know Washington, Mr. Tompkins. General Donovan's blessing won't help you, he declared. They hate his guts for trying to make them combine. However, if you think you can get to see him on your own, go right ahead. But for God's sake, don't say the Bureau sent you over. All right, I agreed. Then I take it I'm under open arrest? I won't try to leave town without telling you. Any suggestions of where I can find a hotel room for the next few days? Lamb leaned back in his chair and grinned boyishly. The Bureau has a lot of authority, he declared, but it's not God. There won't be a hotel room to be had for love or money for the next 2 weeks. Roosevelt's death is bringing everybody back to Washington. President Truman is taking over, and most officials are too busy to be bothered. Usually it's not hard to get a hotel room over the weekend, but not this time. If you can't get accommodations, phone back here, and we'll fix you up with a cot somewhere in the FBI barracks. Then I'm in the clear so far as you are concerned? I suggested. Lamb smiled cryptically. I didn't say that, he remarked, and it isn't so. We have nothing specific to hold you on, but the Alaska is missing. And if you insist, the president is dead, and you're caught in the middle. What will it take to get myself cleared? I asked. Lamb considered. If you can get ONI off our necks with a clean bill of health, we'll relax, he admitted. But I give you 24 hours to do it. Admiral Ballister's pretty worked up on this Alaska business, and he wants action. I nodded. Okay, I'll give it to him, I said. Okay, Tompkins, he remarked. It's your funeral. But remember, if you're not cleared in 24 hours, we'll be calling you in again, and this time we'll give you the works. Luck was with me. I left the FBI and walked up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Willard. As I followed the queue to the registration clerk at the desk, I heard the man just ahead of me start to say, I want to cancel. Just a moment, sir, the clerk said as he picked up the telephone. Yes, madam? No, I'm sorry. I plucked at the man's sleeve. Don't cancel if it's for tonight, I said. Here's $100, and I held out two $50 bills. The man nodded. Okay, buddy, he agreed, pocketing the money. The name's R.L. Grant of Detroit. Name, please, the clerk asked. R.L. Grant of Detroit, I answered. I have a reservation. Right, he said. Lucky for you, you wired a week ago. Here you are, Mr. Grant. Please register. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After lunch, which was poor, slow, and expensive, I screwed up my courage and telephoned the Office of Strategic Services. "May I speak to Mrs. Jacklin?" I asked the switchboard girl. She promptly referred me to information, who told me that Mrs. Dorothy Jacklin was on extension 3046. "Shall I connect you?" A moment later, a pleasant voice said, "Yes, this is Mrs. Jacklin." "Mrs. Jacklin," I told my wife, "my name is Tompkins, W.S. Tompkins. I have a message for you from Commander Jacklin." "Oh," she said. It was not a question. "Are you a friend of Frank's? Is he all right?" "He asked me to see you when I got to Washington and gave me some special messages for you. I'm staying at the Willard. Are you free for cocktails or dinner this evening?" Something of the urgency in my voice communicated itself to her, and I could feel her reverse her original impulse to refuse the invitation. "Why, yes, Mr. Tompkins," she agreed. "I'd be glad to join you. For cocktails, that is. Shall we say about 5:30? "Splendid. I'll meet you in the south lobby. I'm sure to recognize you. Frank gave me such a good description of you. If there's any slip-up, have one of the bellboys page me." "Thank you," she said. "I'll be there." As I laid down the telephone, my pulse was racing and my throat was dry. How in God's name should I act with her? 5:30 crawled around. I filled in some of the time by phoning the FBI and telling Lamb's secretary I was registered at the Willard under the name of R.L. Grant. I phoned Bedford Hills and told Jimmy that I was in Washington and wanted her to join me at the Willard. She was a little slow about getting the R.L. Grant angle, but allowed that she could register as Mrs. Grant or Mrs. John Doe if necessary. And when was all this nonsense going to stop? In spite of my assurance, I almost failed to recognize Dorothy. She looked younger, smarter, and infinitely more self-possessed, and the tanned and muscular young man in uniform who accompanied her was obviously not animated by brotherly sentiments toward her. "Mrs. Jacklin?" I asked. "I'm Tompkins, and—" I turned eloquently to her escort. "Oh, this is Major Demarest," she said. "Thanks, Tony, for escorting me. I'll see you later." 6:30-ish? Demarest asked. "Say 7, Dorothy told him. "I'll meet you here by the desk." So I was neatly bracketed. While Dorothy and I were talking, her escort would be waiting, impatiently. There was no chance of a prolonged operation. I must keep things moving. I took her to the rather garish cocktail lounge on the east side of the hotel and ordered her a bourbon old-fashioned and a scotch and soda for myself. "Frank told me that's what you like," I remarked before she could raise her eyebrows, after I told the waiter to bring a sliver of lemon peel to go with the old-fashioned. "Where did you know him?" she asked. I leaned confidently across the table. "Mrs. Jacklin," I told her, "I'm in intelligence. Tompkins is my name, but I don't use it much. I've seen quite a bit of your husband during the past few years, here at Washington and out in the Pacific. In fact," I added, "I might say that I'm his closest friend. We were at school together many years ago. I'm surprised he never mentioned me." "How is he?" she asked. I know too much to ask where he is. I looked gravely at her. "We don't know where he is," I replied. "His ship hasn't been reported for nearly 2 weeks. He was on a special mission. That's why I've looked you up. Frank made me promise that I would, he thought." Dorothy drained her glass and gave me a long, strange look. "Are you trying to tell me that he's dead?" she asked. "It's not official," I said. "It may never be confirmed, but I personally am sure as I'm sitting here, that you will never see him again." She looked down at the table and nervously tapped an unlighted cigarette against her lacquered thumbnail. "I'll have another drink if you don't mind," she said. "It's not that... Well, our marriage was over long ago, but I signaled our waitress and duplicated our order. This is one of the times when my father told me to remember the giants, she said. I raised my eyebrows. My father was professor of philosophy at Wesleyan, she explained. He always said that it was impossible to imagine anything so big that there wasn't something else bigger. He said that it stood to reason that somewhere in this universe there was a race of giants so big that it took them 1,000,000 years to draw a breath. He said when things seemed difficult, just to think about that. Sounds like the Navy Department, I observed. Was he the one who argued that there might be several sexes? Frank told me something. She smiled. Yes, that was when I was adolescent and having crushes about boys. He said that somewhere there must be a place where instead of 2, there were 6 or 7 sexes. He suggested that falling in love under those conditions was really complicated. He was a nice man, she added. He's dead. Your father sounds like a right guy, I remarked. Frank said, How do I know you're telling the truth? She suddenly interrupted. What proof have you? Here I was on home ground. Frank thought of that. He told me to remind you that you have a mole on your left hip, that you're nuts about Prokofiev, that you don't think much of Ernest Hemingway as an author, and... The louse! She exclaimed. Oh, I know I oughtn't to talk about him this way if he's dead, but I didn't dream men told each other. I pulled out my fountain pen and wrote my Jacqueline signature rapidly across the back of the drink card. I pushed it at her across the table. There, I told her. Recognize that, Mrs. Jacqueline? Why, Dorothy exclaimed, it's his writing. Who are you, Mr. Tompkins? Only I could say that it's a forgery. Listen, Dorothy, I began conspiratorially. And if I call you Dorothy, it is only because your husband always spoke of you as Dorothy. I must see General Donovan. This is much more than a matter of your husband and yourself. It's a matter of top echelon intelligence. She looked downcast. The general's out of town, she said. He's trying to get back for the Roosevelt funeral, but the man who's running the show in his absence is Colonel McIntosh. Ivor McIntosh. There was a curl to her lips as she pronounced the name that told me all I needed to know about the colonel. Still, beggars can't be choosers, and Colonel McIntosh was ever so much better than nothing at all. Very well, I told her. Will you arrange to have me see Colonel McIntosh tomorrow morning? Here I took a leap. Tell him that I'm from the White House. You aren't, are you? Of course not, but I gather that's the kind of bait your colonel needs. He's a very clever man, Dorothy belatedly defended him. They say he did brilliant staff intelligence work under Stilwell in the first Burma campaign. That's the one we lost, isn't it? I asked dryly. No, Dorothy, let me see this colonel. You know how to fix it. There's always one special girl in an office that has the ear of a man like that. Frank swore to me that there was nothing you couldn't do if you decided it was worthwhile. She looked at me across the little round black table. Mr. Tompkins, she said, I have no way of telling whether you are telling the truth or not. Frankly, if General Donovan was in town, I wouldn't bother him. But Colonel McIntosh is, one of the Chicago McIntoshes. You never heard of him? Nobody else did either, but here he is with a British accent, and if you can make the grade with him, it won't worry me. I ordered another round of drinks. Tell me, Dorothy, I said, not that it's any of my business, except that I was a friend of your husband's, don't you feel any special regret that he's probably gone west? She took a man-sized swallow of her old-fashioned. Not particularly, she admitted. In a general, normal sort of way, I'm sorry, of course. He was nice even if we didn't get on very well. But we had almost no interests in common, and when we broke up, it was for keeps. He was kind and, on the whole, decent, but God, so stuffy and boring to live with. Day after day, Hartford, Connecticut, writing and yesing, living by minutes and dying by inches. He rather liked it. I couldn't understand it. So you can see why I can't pretend to be prostrated. And perhaps he isn't dead at all." I nodded. "He's dead if that's the way you feel about him," I said. "He told me that his wife was a lovely girl with a mole on her hip and a hell of a temper. He said it was like being married to a circus acrobat or an opera singer. Exciting, but not happy. He said you had a habit of—" I stopped in the nick of time. "Oh, he did he?" she snapped. "Well, Mr. Tompkins, I don't suppose he ever told you that he snored or that—" "Skip it, please," I calmed her. "It's your marriage, not mine. I told you these things so you'd know I was really sent to you by Frank. Now you fix it so I can talk to McIntosh." "I will," she replied. It was the epitaph on 10 years of marriage. I knew when I was licked. Dorothy was what she had been when I had picked her out of Middletown. As inaccessible as the root of a Greek aorist or as a book of curiosa in a Carnegie library. She had not shown a trace of recognizing Frank Jacklin inside the body of Winnie Tompkins, even though my morning calisthenics were reducing my circumference. I was licked. I was no Faustus to woo this Marguerite, especially when she obviously had someone else on the string. The master of the rat race obviously meant me to play the hand he had dealt me, and no joker. By Godfrey, it would go hard with Dorothy's boss when I came to grips with him. All the Navy men who had been hitched by Washington would applaud me. Marty Donnell, who had been sent out against the Nagato with the wrong size shells for his guns. Abby Roseman, who had been cashiered because he had refused to okay a travel order for the Admiral's sweetie. Julius Winterbottom, who had died on the Lexington, and all the gobs who had died. Well, win or lose, I'd give the FBI a run for its money. Colonel Ivor McIntosh, of the Chicago Macintoshes, was one of those who had been born with a platinum spoon and a broad A in his mouth. His face bore the marks of years of application to the more expensive tables, cellars, and bedrooms. His uniform was in the U.S. Army, but definitely not of it, having a Seville Row touch that suggested the Guards. He was, he told me, in charge of the OSS until Bill gets back. And what could he do for me? "Colonel," I said, "I came to you in the face of strong opposition from the FBI. I have first-hand information concerning the sinking of the Alaska." "Nonsense," McIntosh replied cheerily. "It was on the map 5 minutes ago. I'm sure it's still there." I smiled. "The USS Alaska, sir," I explained. Colonels love to be called sir, especially by a civilian. "I have the inside story of the sinking of the carrier. The FBI told me it was useless to try to see you or Admiral Ballister. In fact, they ordered me under no circumstances to mention the FBI in connection with my mission." McIntosh toyed with a crystal elephant on his desk. "Exactly what is your mission?" he asked. I drew myself up, not without dignity. "I am with Z2, Colonel," I told him. "And as you know, the Z Bureau reports only to the President." I had heard of G2, A2, even X2. Why not Z2? To end all twos. "Of course," he agreed without bending an eyelash. "But why have you come to see me, Mr. Tompkins?" "Call me Grant, Colonel," I replied with a knowing smile. "That's the name I'm registered under at the Willard. The reason I've come to you is that my orders, which were given to me personally last February by President Roosevelt, were to consult the head of the OSS if anything went wrong. As you undoubtedly know, Roosevelt had a very warm feeling for the OSS, and my instructions have been to work with your men whenever possible. FDR told me that if I needed prompt action at any time, to come to this office and skip the other intelligence services." Colonel McIntosh was only human, if from the Chicago Macintoshes. He relaxed. He almost smiled. "I got back to this country less than 2 weeks ago, Colonel," I told him. "I was working on the other end of the Alaska case, and it's a tough one, when word came of the President's death. My report was due to him at Warm Springs next Monday. Now I'll have to take it up direct with Admiral Ballister. The FBI is trying to block me." "Why?" he asked, but he knew why. I shrugged my shoulders. "You know Washington, Colonel," I said. "The FBI tried to get control of Z2 and was stopped by the other services. Since then, they've refused all cooperation, and I must get to see Admiral Ballister before he goes away for the weekend. Since Roosevelt's death, the whole town has changed, and Truman is too busy and bothered to see Z2 reports." Colonel McIntosh put in some earnest homework on the telephone. "Ballister," he said at last. "McIntosh speaking, OSS. Mr. R.L. Grant, that's not his name, but he's from Z2. Yes, of course you do. That's the special. Yes, that's right, Admiral. He has an urgent report for you. He's been trying to reach you since Thursday, but our good friend J. Edgar has been blocking him. Sure, you remember. That was a couple of years ago when Edgar tried to grab Z2 and we all helped block it. Grant has some hot stuff for you on the Alaska sinking." "Fine. Yes, he'll be over as fast as my car can take him." "Oh, not at all. Always glad to help. As you know, orders are to help Z2 at all times, no questions asked. Nothing on paper." "Righto." McIntosh hung up and turned to me with an air of authority. "That was Admiral Ballister, Mr. Grant," he said. "He'll see you right away. I'll have my chauffeur drive you over to the Navy Department. You can talk freely to the Admiral. He's a sound man." I had won the first round of my match with the FBI. Ballister meant nothing to me, but I had to convince him that I was on the level or Mr. Lamb would close in on me. In any case, I owed it to my Navy friends to take a fall out of the department. After all, I couldn't be worse off than I already was, with the G-men breathing down my neck and me out on open arrest on a charge of treason. The electric chair doesn't look funny when there's even the faintest chance of your sitting in it yourself. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "Name, please?" asked the snippy young thing at the Navy Department reception desk. "R.L. Grant," I told her, "to see Admiral Ballister. By appointment," I added. "Have you any identification, Mr. Grant?" she inquired. "Of course not. Tell the Admiral that Z2 has no identification. He will understand." She looked at me very dubiously, but dialed the telephone and muttered into it. Suddenly she cackled, "You don't say! Sure, I'll send him right up." She beamed at me. "The Admiral is expecting you, sir," she said. "Here's your badge. Will you please sign this form?" She thrust a blue and white celluloid saucer at me with a number on it, and passed a mimeographed form which I duly signed Robert E. Lee, CSA, and which she duly accepted and filed. A Marine sergeant appeared out of the shadows and led me up a flight of stairs and along several unevenly paved concrete floors to an office where a battery of waves and junior lieutenants promptly took me in charge. Admiral Ballister was a civilian's dream of a Navy officer. Every other inch a sailor, as we used to say in the Pacific, with a ruddy face tanned by ocean winds, or rye whiskey, grizzled hair, incipient jowls, a gruff old sea dog manner, and a hearty hand clasp. "Glad to see you, Grant," he told me. "I've been checking up on Z2 since McIntosh called. You boys have been doing one hell of a swell job on your security. There's not a word about you in our files." "Z2, Admiral," I replied modestly, "is forbidden by the terms of the executive order setting us up to put itself on record. We have no identification, we get no glory. But a Z2 agent was in the Jap squadron that attacked Pearl Harbor, and one of our men was military secretary to Rommel in North Africa. At least 2 of our agents hold the rank of general in the Red Army. As you know, sir, we report directly to the President, and always verbally. Nothing on paper." I know.
The Admiral agreed wistfully. "Macintosh is usually all wet." He paused for me to register a flash of strictly subordinate glee at his meteorological witticism. "But he gave me a fill-in on the fine job you did on the Alaska case. I'm afraid I worried your ONI group in New York, sir." In addressing an admiral, the "sir" should not be slurred, but should come out with a touch of whip crack if you wish a promotion in the U.S. Navy. "They almost penetrated my cover as W.S. Tompkins, a Bedford Hills stockbroker with offices in Wall Street, and reported me to the FBI." "Oh!" Ballister seemed relieved. "So you were Tompkins. No wonder Church Street was worried. Of course, they didn't know you were Z2. "Naturally, I couldn't tell them, sir," I confided. "I was due to report to President Roosevelt at Warm Springs next Monday. But since his death, I have to report to you, according to previous White House instructions. The new president hasn't had time to get orientated on Z2 operations, and this Alaska business can't wait, sir." Ballister did some dialing, asked a few terse questions, gruff old sea dog style, over the telephone, and then turned to me. "It's lucky for you, Grant, you didn't try to report to the White House. The Secret Service might have nabbed you," he said. "The naval aide tells me that all Roosevelt's papers and records have been impounded for the Roosevelt estate under the law, and that it may be weeks before they are untangled. Now, tell me about the Alaska. We've had no report on her since early on the 2nd, when she cleared Adak." "Before I report to you, sir," I replied, "I'd rather you ask me a few questions about Alaska and Operation Octopus. In that way, you can satisfy yourself that I know what I'm talking about." "Good," the Admiral grunted. "Wish ONI had as much sense as Z2. Save a lot of time. When was Alaska commissioned?" "Late in February, sir. At Bremerton. Trial run in March to Pearl Harbor, back to San Diego for fueling, and up the coast to Bremerton again. Latest U.S. light carrier in the Pacific. A sneak job. 38 knots at full speed, 8,000-mile cruising radius. 24 planes, 8 light bombers, 16 fighters. Anti-aircraft and radar out of this world." Ballister studied the map of the Pacific across the room from his desk. "Who is her commander, and what's his nickname?" "Captain Horatio McAllister, U.S.N., sir. Commonly known as Stinky McAllister. No reason assigned for Stinky, at least so far as reserve officers knew." "Stinky? That's because he once used perfumed soap before going to the Midshipmen's Ball in Washington," the Director of Naval Intelligence informed me. "It was his second year at Annapolis. Who was Stinky's exec?" "Commander B.S. Moody, sir," I answered. "His nickname is suggested by his initials. A roly-poly sort of guy, and hipped on boat drills and all that." Ballister glanced at a list on his desk. "Her chaplain?" he asked. "Father Eamon de Valera O'Flaherty, begob and begorra, saving your reverence," was my reply. "A grand man and a good priest. God rest his soul." Ballister wriggled in his chair with some discomfort, as though he felt he ought to stand at attention or order a volley fired over the ship's side. "What about Commander Chalmers?" he inquired, with an air of baiting an elephant trap for me. "What job did he do?" "Chalmers was not a commander, sir," I told him. "He was a civilian. He had some kind of thorium bomb, and the chief job he did was to use it to blow up the ship. The mission was to drop it on Paramushiro before the Army could get going with its uranium bomb. Chalmers got cold feet, sir, when he thought of the carrier instead. He argued that the Navy Department would conclude that thorium was unreliable and drop the atomic project until the end of the war." Ballister leaned back in his chair and gave careful consideration to the design of his Annapolis-class pin. After a long pause, he swung around in his swivel chair and faced me squarely. "Grant," he barked, "I'm going to ask you an unofficial question. You don't have to answer it. I have no authority over Z2 anyway, but this is mighty important to the Navy." "Go ahead, sir," I told the Admiral. If I can answer it, I'll tell you why. Do you believe, the chief of ONI asked slowly, that Chalmers could have been inspired by another government agency to make a failure of... He paused. Operation Octopus, sir? Right. Could Chalmers have deliberately destroyed Alaska and sacrificed his life in the interest of General Groves and the Army's bomb? Groves was a new name to me, but I took it in my stride. I looked the Admiral full in the eye, a thing which admirals rate along with a snappy "sir" as proof of initiative, intelligence, and subordination on the part of their inferiors. "I am not at liberty to answer that question, Admiral," I replied. "My orders forbid me to discredit any of the armed forces of the United States. After all, sir," I added, "we must not forget that Professor Chalmers paid for his loyalty with his life." Ballister's face lighted up with nautical glee. "I knew it! I knew it!" he roared. "By God, I knew there was something wrong the last time I consulted G2. They were so smug and polite. I might have known that they were cooking up something to get even with the Navy for winning the war in the Pacific. My God, Grant, you have to respect the Army for their fanaticism, if for nothing else. Here is a civilian like Chalmers, a great scientist, proved 100% reliable by all of our tests. We checked him for 12 months before we even approached him on the thorium research. Yet the Army, the damned, stinking, two-timing, gold-bricking, double-crossing, medal-splashing, glory-grabbing, credit-claiming Army gets next to him on the sly and persuades him to blow himself up rather than let the Navy get ahead with its atomic bomb." I nodded admiringly at his flow of language. "Admiral," I told him, "when I came into this office, I had a notion that you were just another Washington desk hero. No man who can express himself with such eloquence can have shirked his sea duty. Mind you, sir," I continued, "I do not state that the Army had a hand in this outrage. All I ask is that you give me clearance to the head of Army Intelligence, whoever he is now. They keep shipping them into, quote, war zones, unquote, so they can qualify for active service pay and allowances, campaign ribbons and citations to back up a special act of Congress for their permanent promotion to the rank of Major General. West Point," Ballister began and emerged panting 5 minutes later, after a personally conducted tour of the United States Military Academy. "Yes, Mr. Grant," Ballister was all but chanting as he concluded. "I'll send you over to see that prince of double-crossers, Major General Ray L. Wakely, Director of Army Counterintelligence, so-called. Mind you, he probably won't admit you to the Pentagon, coming from me, or if he does, he'll try to frame you." "Z2, Admiral," I answered him, "is entirely familiar with General Wakely's methods and reputation. I can take care of myself if you can get me into the Pentagon. I have some reports, entirely apart from the Alaska business, which belong to the Army, and I should deliver them to Wakely in person. As you know, Z2 is not allowed to take part in interdepartmental feuds." "That's all very well," Ballister barked at me, "but right is right and wrong is wrong. You're not supposed to be blind to that, are you?" "You ought to know where our sympathies lie, sir," I snapped back. "But my orders are to see Wakely, if he's in charge of counterintelligence." This was sheer bravado. As a matter of fact, I knew I ought to call it a day now that Ballister was in my camp, but the best way to keep him on my side was to move against his Army opponents. I felt rather like a slug in a slot machine as it starts to hit the jackpot. I would teach the FBI not to monkey with Winnie Tompkins. Z2 had been a happy thought. So far, nobody had gagged on it, and with Roosevelt's papers tied up, the war would be over before any of the topside officials guessed I had invented it. Ballister calmed down enough to buzz his secretary and tell her to get General Wakely on the line, but fast. A moment later, the gruff old sea dog was talking to the double-crossing Army counterintelligence director. "Hello, Ray. This is Ballister. How's your golf?" "Too bad. Neither can I." "Well, there's a civilian here you ought to see. Grant, R.L. Not his real name, of course. From Z2. Yes, Z as in zebra, 2 as in 2. He's just cleaned up one of our worst headaches and says he has some special reports for you." "No idea, Ray. He didn't tell me, and I didn't ask him. Z2 doesn't talk. No, not in the least like our Edgar or Wild Bill. Can you see him today?" I shook my head. "Sorry, sir," I interrupted the Admiral. "I can't see him until tomorrow morning at 7:30. The Admiral winced as though a cobra had suddenly appeared on his bladder. Then he grinned maliciously. "Hold on a minute, Ray," he said. "You can have your golf this afternoon after all. Grant says he can't see you until tomorrow at 7:30. Yes, 7:30. No, 10 o'clock will be too late, he says. At your office at 7:30 then." He hung up and turned back to me. "You know, Grant," he remarked, "I wouldn't mind belonging to Z2 for a few days myself if I could make that scoundrel Wakely rise at an ungodly hour on Sunday morning." "His little whack won't like it?" I insinuated. "Little whack!" Ballister exploded. "She weighs a good 160 pounds and stands 5 feet 8 in her bedroom slippers. Naturally, she's working for the Navy. We have to establish some liaison with G2. Poor old Wakely will catch holy hell from her for this. Have you any other appointments I could help you with, Grant?" "No, sir. I did this to General Wakely because the last time one of our Z2 agents had to report to G2, General Strong, you remember that old hellion, kept our man waiting for 2 hours. That's as bad as though you kept the President of the United States waiting." Ballister appeared slightly worried. "You know, Grant," he told me, "I see your point. I sympathize with your attitude, but these inter-service feuds can lead to trouble. The thing to do is to be pleasant and friendly as hell and not get him sore over trifles, but wait for a chance to stab him in the back. I think you would have been wiser not to annoy General Wakely. When G2 is annoyed, there is absolutely nothing of which they are not capable. They are the most unconscionable, unscrupulous, prevaricating, meretricious, double-dyed sons of bachelors on the face of the globe. Hitler," the Admiral continued, "fights a clean war compared to G2. You may be in Z2 and you may represent the Commander-in-Chief, Grant, but Roosevelt is dead. Roosevelt is dead, sir. This guy Truman was in the Army in the last war, and the Army is going to take him right over and run him and the White House inside of 6 weeks. Hell, I wouldn't put it past them to try to have the Army swallow up the Navy. So, don't annoy Wakely if you can help it, Grant." I shook my head. "If it's the last thing Z2 ever does, Admiral," I told him, "I still want to make a Major General get up early in the morning in order to see me." Ballister grinned. "Grant," he said, "how come you never thought of joining the Navy? We could use men like you. Get in touch with me if anything happens to Z2. This here war may be just about won, but then there's no armistice in the Battle of Washington." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There is no point in describing the various problems of logistics involved in my reaching General Wakely's office in the Pentagon early on Sunday morning. All the Pentagon stories have been invented and told, including my favorite yarn of the German spy who was told to bomb the building but decided to disobey his orders because there was no point in robbing the Third Reich of its greatest asset. Wakely was a bluff, hardy type of soldier, with more bluff than heart, who greeted me without emotion, waved me to a chair, and proceeded to get down to cases. "I've decided, Grant, and the Chief of Staff agrees," he informed me, "that the time has come to liquidate Z2. All of these irregular agencies have been nothing but a nuisance since before Pearl Harbor. Z2 has been in the Army's hair for years. We've heard nothing good of your outfit." "You are fully entitled to your point of view, General. I have observed that generals do not go for sir as eagerly as admirals. But the decision rests with the White House. All I do is follow my orders." General Wakely exhumed a ghastly smile. "The White House ain't what it used to be, Grant," he continued. "While Roosevelt was president, we couldn't do much about it. But now, by gad, the time has come to coordinate the White House. This Z2 business is played out anyhow." I started to say something soothing, but the Chief of Military Intelligence refused to yield the floor. "I've been checking on you, Grant," he told me, "since Ballister phoned me yesterday. We have a pretty good counterintelligence corps in this country, and I'm told that your name isn't Grant at all, but Tompkins, W.S. Tompkins. You're linked to a fellow in the Navy named Jacklin. No use pretending, Grant. Z2 may be smart, but our information is that Jacklin is probably a double spy for the Nazis. In fact, we believe that Jacklin is really the notorious von Bieberstein. We were on his trail long before Pearl Harbor. He's a slick article, von Bieberstein is. We think that when things began to get hot, he joined the Navy, knowing that the Army couldn't touch him there. Then he seems to have planted his common-law wife or mistress, an American-born girl, mind you, in OSS to keep him informed of Army operations. No, Tompkins, we have him now. We have rounded up all his contacts and accomplices." "General," I assured him, "somebody's eaten a bad clam. I can vouch for Jacklin's loyalty as I would my own. Why, he was editor of a Republican newspaper and went to Yale. He was at school with me. I've known him for over 30 years. He's as patriotic as I am. This was not going as well as I had hoped. If it hadn't been for the FBI waiting to snap me up, I would have backed out of Wakely's office on some excuse, however lame." Wakely snorted. "It just shows how far-sighted the Germans are. They plant their agents here 20, 30, 50 years, yes, generations, before they are needed. God, this country's been asleep. Here, MID's been hunting von Bieberstein for the last 10 years, and what do we find? We find that he's lived in this country all his life and holds a reserve commission in the United States Navy. No wonder we had Pearl Harbor. This time, Grant, we're sure of our facts, and we're going to take them to the White House." "You may be sure of your facts, General," I agreed. "But do you happen to know a man named Axel Roscommon?" Wakely nodded. "Of course, a thorough gentleman. See him every week or so at the Army-Navy Club. Well informed, too." "Did he ever tell you that he's head of Nazi intelligence in this country?"
"Rubbish!"
The head of G2 detonated impressively.
"He's nothing of the kind. That's nothing but a smear put out against him by the FBI.
"Well, General," I admitted, "I'm wasting your time. I have some reports."
Just a minute, Grant. I'm not done with you. We're going to finish this Z2 business right now."
He pushed a button and uttered into his desk phone,
"Sergeant, bring those women in here."
A moment later, the door opened and Dorothy, Germaine, and Virginia appeared, each looking as bedraggled as any woman who has been awakened too early. "Winnie!" Germaine's face lighted up like a traffic ghost sign. She crossed the room and kissed me. "I thought..." General Wakely coughed severely.
"Mrs. Tompkins," he announced, "I'm Major General Wakely. This is G2. The CIC has rounded up your husband's chief associates for this interview. We're about to close in on the most dangerous Nazi spy ring in existence. You know Mrs. Rutherford, of course, and this other woman goes under the name of Mrs. Jacklin."
"My name is Mrs. Jacklin," Dorothy replied with feeling. "And the OSS will want to know by what authority..." Wakely waved her and the OSS aside.
Very clever, Mrs. Jacklin. Or should I say, Mrs. von Bieberstein.
He turned back to Germaine.
Thanks in part to your husband, Mrs. Tompkins, he continued, we have at last got on the track of Hitler's ace operative in the Western Hemisphere, Kurt von Bieberstein. Or should I say, Frank Jacklin. We almost had him cornered 5 years ago, but he took advantage of the confusion after Pearl, after the Navy after the declaration of war, and went into hiding as a naval officer. It was only by accident, when Mr. Tompkins accidentally supplied the missing link, that we found the trail again.
That's handsome of you, General, I said, but I think that counterintelligence deserves full credit. He beamed at me. And what am I doing here, General Wakely? Virginia cooed at the specimen of military manhood. Wakely smiled before he remembered that he was a pattern of military efficiency.
You are known to counterintelligence, Mrs. Rutherford, as one of the best agents in Z2.
But what is Z2? Virginia was frankly bemused. Of course, I've heard of intelligence. Isn't that something that belongs to the Army? The General oozed approval.
Gad Tompkins, you train your agents well. She'd never admit a syllable without your permission. No, Mrs. Rutherford, Z2 is to be liquidated, and we're here to find this fellow von Bieberstein.
Dorothy stood up. I've heard all the drivel I propose to stand for, she announced. Frank is a decent, loyal American, and it's not his fault that we couldn't get along together. I've never heard of von Bieberstein in my life. Mr. Tompkins, she added, turning to me, if you had anything to do with this high-handed foolishness. You say you knew Frank. Mrs. Jacklin, I told her, I don't think that your husband, and I knew him well, was disloyal for one moment of his life. In any case, military intelligence can't lay a finger on your husband.
And why not?
Wakely demanded. Because he's dead, General, I said.
Suicide, huh?
No, sir. He went down with... Winnie! Jimmy interrupted me as though descending from a fiery cloud. Now I see why you've been acting so strangely. You're in intelligence. Of course, you couldn't tell anybody. Darling. Even the General looked embarrassed. Dorothy did not relax. I am going to leave this room and this building, she announced. And if anybody interferes with me, you are all witnesses that I am being detained illegally. Just call the OSS and tell them that Army agents under General Wakely's orders broke into my bedroom at 6 this morning and kidnapped me. She turned and left the room. Nobody stopped her. Wakely pressed the buzzer again.
Sergeant, he commanded, see that Mrs. Jacklin is escorted out of the building, and that our people keep an eye on her. Now, Tompkins, the General resumed, what's this word about von Bieberstein being dead?
If you'll have the ladies leave the room, General, I told him, I'll give you my report. Jimmy and Virginia withdrew with visible reluctance. Jacklin is dead, I told him. I think that your agents are mistaken in linking him to von Bieberstein. In fact, I know it, because I think I know who von Bieberstein really is. But I can't tell you without direct verbal authority from the President. I can tell you how Jacklin died. Major General Wakely became once more the man of action.
Good, let's have it.
The Navy Department, I began, has been trying to beat the Army with the development of an atomic bomb.
The dastards! Wakely all but screamed. The dirty, treacherous, sneaking dastards. You can't trust the Navy as far as you could throw a battleship. By gad, Tompkins, this is going straight to the White House.
They had a man named Chalmers who did something with thorium, General, I continued. I'm not a scientist, so I can't tell you about the process. It was simpler and less expensive than what General Groves is trying to do with uranium.
Groves!
Wakely spoke with soldierly pride.
Now there's a West Pointer for you. 4 years and $2 billion, and he hasn't got it yet. But by gad, the old West Point spirit never accepts defeat. He'll get a bomb if it takes 50 years and $100 billion. The Navy can't match that kind of guts, Tompkins. They're all yellow, the Annapolis crowd.
Of course, this thing wasn't anything like so good as the Army's bomb, General, I assured him. It was something whipped up in 18 months and cost less than 50 millions.
Pikers.
Well, the Navy rushed through this sneak bomb of theirs and sent Chalmers with it on a surprise raid against the Kuriles on the latest light carrier, the Alaska. Wakely took a few portentous notes on a memo pad. Jacklin was assigned to the Alaska, and our information is that he was with Chalmers in the ship's magazine when the bomb accidentally went off. The ship was a total loss, and everyone aboard died in the explosion. Wakely got to his feet and stood rigid for a moment.
He was a brave man, Tompkins, he observed with soldierly emotion. A damned brave man. By gad, I'm almost sorry we're going to liquidate Z2. We'd like to take you all over into MID, but red tape won't let us, huh? Have to be in uniform, under West Pointers, or it isn't regular. So Jacklin was one of your men, and he died for the Army. He sank the Alaska and killed himself and the inventor of the thorium bomb rather than let the Navy get away with this outrage. By gad, Tompkins, General Groves will have a laugh over that one. I'll go and apologize to Mrs. Jacklin in person for our mistake. Von Bieberstein would never have done that job. As you know, it's the Nazis who are backing the Navy against the Army. If it wasn't for the Japs backing us against the Navy, we'd have a rough time of it in this man's war. Now, Tompkins, this thing is too big for us to handle. It's got to go up to the highest echelons.
I raised my eyebrows. He nodded.
Yes, this has got to be laid before President Truman himself. By gad, Tompkins, I'll see that you get to report to the President tomorrow morning if I have to take you there myself.
As to von Bieberstein, General, I said, he can wait until tomorrow. When you know who he is and where he is placed, with the President's permission, you will probably decide to go away. After all, even you would hesitate to arrest on a treason charge I stopped. Wakely leaned across his desk.
Tompkins, he assured me, I'll get von Bieberstein if it's the last thing I ever do. By gad, if you help me, I'll see that you get the Order of Merit, a presidential citation, and the Orange Heart.
Don't you mean the Purple Heart? I asked. Wakely snorted.
That's merely for combat duty. The Orange Heart is a confidential decoration given to those who serve intelligence well on the home front, even including civilians. It's like the Army E Award, but is personal and worn on the inside of the coat lapel. It is conferred on the recommendation of the Deputy Chief of Staff, G2.
He buzzed again.
Sergeant, he barked, get me the Office of the Military Aide, the White House, and if they don't answer, wake up Harry Vaughn at Blair House, even if he's still in bed, which he probably is, the lucky stiff. Tell him this is top priority.
I sighed. The water was already far over my head, but it was too late to draw back. I had to swim for the farther shore. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The President will see you now, Mr. Tompkins, said the White House usher as he beckoned me to follow him. A pleasant, rangy, mild-mannered man rose from behind the great desk and shook my hand. Glad to see you, Mr. Tompkins, he said. General Vaughn has been telling me great things about your work. What can I do for you? As I looked at the guileless, friendly face, my heart sank. Here was one man who should not be deceived. It would be as easy as stuffing a ballot box. Mr. President, I told him, When I left the Pentagon building yesterday, I had an elaborate report to submit to you. But I decided that the President of the United States was entitled to the simple truth.
That's right,
snapped the Chief Executive. So if you'll listen to me for 5 minutes, I continued, I'll tell you the strangest story you ever heard. President Truman coughed.
General Vaughn has told me of the fine work you've been doing for Z2, he observed. As you can imagine, I'm terribly busy taking on this job.
Mr. President, I began, to begin with, there's no such organization as Z2. If you'll listen for a few minutes, I'll tell you the whole story. I did. At the end of it, he smiled at me.
Mr. Tompkins, he said, you're a married man, aren't you?
Yes, Mr. President.
Then you tell Mrs. Tompkins, for me, that I want her to take you home and take good care of you for the next few weeks. You've been overdoing it. This Z2 work has taken it out of you. You need a rest. Now, don't you worry about Z2, he continued. What you need to do is to take things easy. The work will go right ahead. I'm putting Z2 under General Wakely. This country needs better intelligence services, and they ought to be concentrated under one responsible head, if you ask me.
But I tell you, Mr. President, I insisted, there never was such an organization as Z2. I invented it in order to clear myself with the FBI. He flashed a boyish grin at me.
But there's no doubt that the Alaska went down like a stone.
She went up like a skyrocket, sir.
Then this thorium bomb doesn't sound as though it was practical, sinking one of our ships like that.
Mr. President, I argued, any bomb will explode if it is deliberately detonated. This bomb was deliberately touched off by Professor Chalmers. He wanted to prevent its use in warfare. The President nodded.
Yes, Mr. Tompkins, you explained that to me before. Now, you be sure to tell your wife to take good care of you. When you're rested up, you come on down and see me again, and we'll talk some more about this Z2 work of yours. We can use men like you in the State Department. I'm sorry I don't know more about it, but all of President Roosevelt's papers have been removed from the White House. And I don't even know what he told Stalin at Yalta. Perhaps you'd better talk to the State Department before you take that rest. That's what they're for. Thank you for seeing me.
2 beefy Secret Service men appeared in the doorway. Is there any particular man I should see at the department, sir? I asked. I want to get this whole business cleared up. The President stood up and shook my hand in dismissal.
Just go across the street and tell them I sent you, he said. Good day to you, sir.
The 2 bodyguards closed in on me, so I bowed slightly and withdrew from the President's office. In the anteroom, I found General Wakely pacing up and down like the father of triplets.
How did it go, Tompkins?
He asked.
You've had 5 extra minutes. Did you get a chance to give him a fill-in about the Navy and you-know-what?
I shook my head. My orders are not to discuss that matter any further, General, I told him.
But what about von Bieberstein?
The chief of MID demanded.
Can you give me a lead?
My instructions, General, I said, are to discuss matters with the State Department.
The State Department?
Wakely was outraged.
Why, they're nothing but a bunch of Reds. They tell me there are men over there who have spent years in Russia.
If I am ever allowed to tell you who von Bieberstein really is, I told the General, you will understand why I am not allowed to discuss it with you now. This is a matter for the Big Three. It is out of my hands entirely. At the gate of the White House Drive, I was suddenly halted by a piercing, "Hi!" It was Virginia Rutherford. She dodged her way between 2 stalwart sentries and took my arm. "Winnie," she cooed as soon as we were across Pennsylvania Avenue, "you utter devil." It seemed safest to say nothing. "Winnie," she continued, "do you realize that the Army of the United States dragged me out of bed yesterday morning and flew me down here just to discover that you are a bigger liar than I thought you were? Please don't blame me for General Wakely," I told her. "He's an Eagle Scout in high places. I was getting on fine until you showed up. And please don't raise your voice at me. If I know the Army, you and I are being tailed right now by the counterintelligence." Virginia snuggled closer to me as we dodged through the crowd in Lafayette Park watching the White House. "To think," she said dreamily, "that all this time you have been an American Secret Service agent. Ain't that something?" Again, it seemed safest to say nothing. "Yes, Winnie Tompkins, super sleuth," she continued, with an edge on her voice you could have shaved with. "All last winter, when I was under the impression that we were canoodling from bar to bar, you were working for Uncle Sam. It's one of the best stories of the war, Winnie. Sleep with Tompkins and lick the Axis." This was getting under my hide. "Virginia," I told her, "I have just spent the last 20 minutes trying to convince President Truman that I'm not a secret agent. He will have none of it. He says I've been working too hard and need a rest." "You devil!" Virginia chuckled dangerously. "You absolute, utter demon. Here is civilization at the crossroads, and what does Winfred S. Tompkins do to amuse himself? He strolls down to Washington and persuades the generals and the admirals and the president that he has been winning the war for them instead of winning the wife of his family physician. That's what I call funny." "Have it your own way," I agreed. "If you can persuade General Wakely that I'm a fake, more power to you. He believes that you are one of my best operatives, and nothing can shake him." "So that's what you call them? Your operatives? That's wonderful. If I'm ever asked, 'Grandma, what did you do in the Second Great War?' I'll say, 'Johnny, I was an operative under W.S. Tompkins, the ace American agent.'" "Would you mind not talking quite so loud?" I again begged her. "Those 2 men following us might misunderstand." She glanced over her shoulder. "You mean those 5 men following us, don't you, Winnie?" I looked behind us. She was right. A group of 5, if not 6, people were trailing along behind us. Lamb and the FBI, Ballister and the Navy, as well as the Army's counterintelligence and the OSS were probably represented. 5 is right, I agreed. You see, Virginia, I'm a pretty important person. You noticed, I hope, that President Truman took time out to chat with me. "What's he like?" she asked irreverently. "Of course, Roosevelt was all wrong, but he had something on the ball. Who's this little guy from Montana, anyhow?" "Missouri," I corrected her. "He's from Missouri, and don't you ever forget it. That's what he is, Virginia, a little guy from Missouri." We were at the Willard. "Here, Virginia, I must leave you," I told her. "You can't follow me up to my bedroom, and anyhow, I have a message for Jimmy from the President of the United States." "Nuts," she answered brightly. "You're not fooling me for one little minute. You just lied yourself into a bigger jam than you've lied yourself out of. Well, I'm on to your game." When I reached the room, there was no sign of Jimmy. This statement should be qualified. She herself was not to be seen, but various articles of clothing were scattered around the room, and there was a rush and gurgle of water from the bathroom, which suggested that my wife was taking a bath. She was. "Winnie?" she called through the half-open door. "Lisa the floor waiter," I grunted. "You wanted me? I busy." "Waiter," she commanded, "please leave the room at once." "What's all so secret, hey?" I asked, still speaking in subject race style. "Let me see." I took the handle of the door, wrenched it open and pushed. There was an angry screech from inside, followed by an indignant, "Winnie, you beast, get out of here." I didn't, so Jimmy dropped the bath towel she had draped defensively across her shoulders and subsided laughing into a warm, soapy bath. "You are the absolute limit," she declared. "I'll never forgive you for this. Tell me what the President was like." "Very nice," I said. "He reminds me of one time I saw a little freshwater college football team play Notre Dame. You sort of wanted the little guys to make at least one first down, but you knew that if they did, it would just be an accident. No, Truman's one hell of a nice guy, but that doesn't mean he could lick Joe Louis. Anyhow, he was complimentary about my work, and he sent a message to you. Pity he couldn't deliver it in person, like the floor waiter. For me? I nodded. He said that I needed a good long rest, and that you must take very good care of me. She looked up at me, large-eyed, through a haze of steam. Oh, Winnie, she declared, I am so proud of you. To think that all the time you've been doing secret intelligence. And I believed you were just chasing around after those silly girls. Don't you think you could have trusted your wife? She asked. I shook my head emphatically. That was part of my cover, I replied. If you hadn't been worried about me, it wouldn't have looked natural. If I'd told you, you wouldn't have worried, and the Axis agents... I left the thought trailing. Germaine sucked reflectively on the corner of her washcloth. Yes, she agreed at last. I can see that, but I don't see how I can ever trust you again. I laughed. Then don't trust me, I told her. We'll still have a good time. Suppose you get dressed now and come downstairs and we'll have champagne cocktails to celebrate. Celebrate what? She asked, loosing the stopper with her toes. Celebrate the liquidation of Z2, I said. It's being taken over by the Army. My work is done anyhow. And tomorrow I have to see the State Department. Mr. Truman tells me they need men like me. God help them. The State Department! She jumped out of the tub, scattering water lavishly on the floor and on me. Are they going to make you an ambassador or something? Come down to earth, Jimmy, I urged her. I'm a Republican from New York, not a Democrat. I may have done an even better job than they think I've done, but I know one thing I didn't do to qualify for a diplomatic job. What's that? She asked, toweling herself vigorously. I never contributed a dime to the Democratic National Committee, I confessed. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was a brisk knock on the bedroom door. I walked over and opened it to see FBI Special Agent A.J. Harcourt. He gave me a reproachful glance and pushed his way into the room. I can only stop a minute, Mr. Tompkins, he said, but I have orders from the director to call on you in person and present the apologies of the Bureau for having inconvenienced you. If you had only told us you were connected with Z2, there would have been no trouble. Sit down, Harcourt, I urged him. Then I crossed to the bathroom door. Don't come out till you're decent, dear, I called to Germaine. The FBI is here. Some muffled instructions answered, so I went around the room and picked up the various scattered wisps of silk and rayon and thrust them through to my wife.
That's all I wish to say, Mr. Tompkins,
Harcourt repeated, still standing, that the Bureau is mighty sorry about the whole business. Sit down, I told him again. Now get this Z2 thing straight. There isn't any Z2. I just invented it, trying to get myself out of this jam. I never was a Z2 agent. What I told these people was all moonshine. Harcourt nodded. We know, of course, that you're not allowed to admit you're in Z2 to anybody but the top guys. But we know that Z2 does exist. If it didn't, how could the President abolish it? How's that again? I asked, sinking into the one easy chair. Yeah, Special Confidential Executive Order number 1734, signed today, abolishing Z2 and transferring its duties to the War Department. There was something else, too, about giving you the Order of Merit for, quote, special services which contributed usefully to the conduct of the war, unquote. Listen here, Harcourt, I insisted. I can't help it if the President pulled a boner. I told him there wasn't any such thing as Z2, and all he said was that I ought to take a good long rest. I simply got so damn tired of trying to prove that I couldn't remember what Winnie Tompkins had been doing before April 2nd that I invented my own alibi, Z2. Harcourt scratched his head. Cross my heart and hope to die, I assured him. For the first time since he had delivered his wooden official apology, the special agent relaxed.
That's one for the books,
he said with deep feeling.
Mrs. Harcourt's little boy isn't going to let it go any farther. So far, only the President of the United States, the Army, the Navy, OSS, and the FBI believe you were in Z2. I'm not sticking my neck out to tell them it's all a lot of malarkey. That leaves only the State Department and the Secret Service. How come you've skipped them? You must be slipping, Mr. Tompkins. I'm seeing the State Department tomorrow morning, I explained. I think I'll let the Secret Service alone.
Incidentally, Mrs. Tompkins also believes all this Z2 business. It will do as a stall until I learn what I was really doing before I drew a blank. Not for me. We both looked up. In the doorway, which I must have forgotten to latch, stood Virginia Rutherford. No, Winnie, she began. Oh, hello, Mr. Harcourt. You haven't fooled me. I know there's something behind all this business. Imagine the nerve of that silly general, practically jerking me out of bed to come down and listen to him babble about von Bieberstein to that pretty Mrs. Jacqueline. Who is this von Bieberstein, anyhow? He sounds like a brewer.
Kurt von Bieberstein, explained A.J. Harcourt, is supposed to be the ace Nazi operative in the USA. The Bureau has been trying to locate him for the last 10 years. We don't know what he looks like, nothing about him except his name. All we ever got on him was one fragment of a shortwave message in 1935 and a letter in a code we couldn't break just before Pearl Harbor. The bathroom door opened and Germaine entered the room. Well, Virginia, she observed, you seem to be making yourself at home. Mr. Harcourt, have I no legal right to privacy in my hotel room? Harcourt rose and bowed. Certainly, ma'am, he told her. If you object to her presence, you are entitled to order her out. If she refuses to go, you can throw her out or call the house detective.
Jimmy laughed. Good. Virginia Rutherford, you get out of my bedroom or I'll throw you out. Virginia relaxed back against the pillow. Act your age, dearest, she said. You don't want any public scandal about your husband, do you? Oh, Germaine paused. Of course not. There was another knock on the door. Come in, we chorused. This time it was Dorothy Jacqueline. Oh, she exclaimed, none too brightly. So we're all here. This is Mr. Harcourt of the FBI, Mrs. Jacqueline, I said. He's an old friend of mine. Dorothy turned to me. There's one thing I'd like cleared up, Mr. Tompkins, she said. Yes, I asked. I certified to OSS that you were with Z2. I've checked over our confidential files and I can't find any record of Z2. Things like that go on my efficiency rating and I might get into trouble. After all, you were admitted to the administration building without the usual references and identification. General Donovan is very strict about such things. There's no such thing as Z2, Mrs. Jacqueline, I assured her. Aha! Virginia chortled. Here it comes. Winnie. Germaine was hurt. President Truman just today signed a special order abolishing Z2 and transferring its duties to the War Department. If you need the references for the OSS record, that dear little colonel of yours can get it from General Wakely at G2. That's right, isn't it, Harcourt? That's right, Mr. Tompkins. All government intelligence agencies have been notified. When you get back to your office, Mrs. Jacqueline, you'll find that OSS has a copy of the order. Dorothy turned to me. Isn't that lousy? She exclaimed. After all the splendid work Z2 did to have the Army take it over and grab the credit. I shrugged my shoulders. It's what we expect in this government game, I said. A passion for anonymity is not only expected of us, it's rammed down our throats. Only admirals and generals are good at intelligence, period. However, I'm just as glad it's over. The president told me to take a rest, and I think it's a good idea. Well, said Germaine, of all ingratitude. I think the best idea is for us all to go downstairs and have some champagne cocktails, I suggested. Things often seem better that way. Harcourt looked grave. I am not allowed to drink on duty, Mr. Tompkins, he observed. But I'm not on duty now. Come on, Mrs. Jacklin, he continued. Let's go on and show them. Dorothy looked startled. Show them what? She asked. Show them that we intelligence services can take it, ma'am, the special agent observed. You're OSS and I'm FBI, and these others have just been consolidated out of the game. Dorothy flashed him a smile. Well, she began doubtfully. Go ahead, Harcourt, I urged, with malice aforethought. Show her a photo of your wife and 3 children in Brooklyn. He grinned. That gag was strictly for Miss Briggs, he said. But down here, I'm an unmarried man. Pooh, said Dorothy. I never saw an administrator down here yet who let himself worry about a wife and family somewhere else. The FBI must be weakening. Harcourt smiled. Well, anyhow, Mrs. Jacklin, ma'am, the first round of drinks is on me, just to celebrate Mr. Tompkins' happy release. I didn't care so much for that one. Expense account, you spy catcher? I asked. The special agent nodded. Yep, he agreed. My own expense. I was ordered to apologize handsome to you, sir, for the Bureau. And by gum, we Harcourts do it right. What'll it be, root beer or Moxie? The next morning, early if not bright, found me fumbling my way around the corridors of the State War Navy building in search of the proper official to handle secret intelligence reports. I finally unearthed him in the form of 6 feet of languid Bond Street tailored perfection. A red-headed diplomat lily by the name of Dennis Tyler, chief of the liaison section. To him I addressed myself. Oh yes, so you're Tompkins of Z2, he observed. Yes, quite too tragic for you. Tell me, Mr. Tyler, I inquired, did you ever hear of Axel Roscommon? Tyler leaned back in his chair and contemplated me soulfully. Now, don't tell me that poor old Axel is a Nazi agent, Mr. Timpkins. Tompkins, Mr. Wiley. The name is Tyler, Mr. Tompkins, he grinned. No, dear old boy, to quote Axel, we do not think that Mr. Roscommon is a Nazi agent. We know it. I had a devil of a time fixing it up with the FBI so they wouldn't arrest him. We can't let the Swiss, God bless their cuckoo clocks, represent Hitler over here. We need a man of the world who realizes that milk chocolate has no place in diplomacy to maintain contact with the Third Reich. No, Axel's a fine fellow. He's on a strict allowance. 1 military secret a month, usually a little one and every now and then a phony, so as to keep his job. He sees that our people in Berlin get the same allowance. All very cozy and no harm done. I nodded agreement. Yes, Mr. Tyler, I told him. I know the picture. It's just that I have a hunch that Roscommon may be Kurt von Bieberstein. Tyler exploded. Absolute obscene rot, Tompkins. Not a word of truth in it. Roscommon is foxy, if you like, but he hasn't got von Bieberstein's ruthlessness. No, we made a thorough check on our Axel before we let the Gestapo accredit him to this government. He's just a good contact man and a first-rate field operative. Plays a dashing game of backgammon and a sound hand of poker. Holds his liquor well, and, with an unlimited expense account, stands unlimited rounds of drinks. No, we can't get on without Axel Roscommon. He's taken half the sting out of my income tax. He's so lavish with his friends. What on earth made you confuse him with von Bieberstein? He concluded. Kurt's a devil. He's slipped through the fingers of every Allied intelligence service. Even the Gestapo doesn't know much about him. He's never been photographed or fingerprinted, and he reports directly to Hitler. Even Himmler has no file on him." "It was only this, Mr. Tyler," I told him. "It was Roscommon who warned me 2 days before Roosevelt's death that the President would die within the week. That isn't easy to laugh off." Tyler became deadly calm.
"Don't ever repeat that story outside of this room," he warned me. "We know who did it and why. We'll settle that score someday. In the meantime, just forget it, unless you don't mind diving into the East River in a concrete lifebelt."
"Then Roscommon wasn't guessing," I observed.
"Of course he wasn't guessing. As a matter of fact, it was I who told him. Just as it was I who told FDR. God, he was a good sport. He listened to what I had to say, and then, do you know what he did? He laughed. He said that so many Americans had died in this war that one more made no difference, and he ordered me to hold off until after the peace treaty before getting the group responsible." This was getting too deep for me, but I owed it to Germaine to make a grab for the brass ring. "President Truman was very complimentary about my work for Z2, I told him. "He wants me to take a rest now that the War Department has taken over our work." After that, I wondered whether there mightn't be something in the diplomatic service. The President thought I would be useful here. I've plenty of money and... Dennis Tyler groaned convulsively, hunched forward over his desk, and clutched his flaming red head in his hands. "And you have a beautiful wife who would make a charming American ambassadress, no doubt." "Yes, Mr. Tompkins, I see it all. You went to a good school. No doubt you even attended Harvard. You just missed combat service in the last war, and were, unfortunately, too old for this one. You know how to make money in Wall Street, if it wasn't for those damned Roosevelt taxes. You do not speak French, except for the purpose of la vie parisienne, nor German, nor Italian, nor Spanish, nor Russian. Not to mention Arabic and Chinese. You know nothing of economics, sociology, natural science, or political geography. You have been to Canada, the West Indies, and no doubt to Gay Paris, and to cap the list of your qualifications, you are a Republican and this is a Democratic administration." "Then there isn't a chance?" I mumbled, my cheeks flaming with embarrassment. "Did I say you had no chance?" demanded Dennis Tyler. "On the contrary. You seem to be fully qualified for any diplomatic post within the gift of this administration, at least as much as any of a dozen of our well-named envoys extraordinary. But, Tompkins, you're a decent sort of chap. Don't do it. For your wife's sake, if not mine, let the poor old State Department go to hell in its own quiet way without speeding the process. Oh well, I suppose I shall never learn. Doubtless you will be our next ambassador to Portugal, and I shall have one more black mark against me." I held out my hand. "If the popular demand becomes too great for me to resist, Mr. Tyler," I assured him, "I may be forced to accept a diplomatic appointment. But even then you would be safe from me. I don't like double talk." Dennis Tyler looked up, shook my hand, and winked broadly at me. "Just between us, Tompkins," he whispered, "who put you up to that Z2 line of yours? You have the whole town fooled. No, don't look virtuous, dear old boy. Again, to quote the immortal Axl, I happen to know that you can't possibly be connected with Z2, because until yesterday when the Army grabbed it, I was head of Z2 myself." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "You were what?" I demanded. "I am, or was, the head of Z2, Tyler replied. "You know, Mr. Tompkins," he continued, "I find it most intensely interesting that you should have picked on that particular combination, Z2, for your higher echelonics. In fact, I should like to have you psychoanalyzed in order to learn why you, of all people, should have selected the super-secret insignia of the super-secret Roosevelt intelligence outfit. Not that it matters now, of course," he added.
With this new growth across the street, I'd be lucky if the White House knew the difference between Z2 and B29. I studied Tyler's face. Who he was, I had only a remote idea. So many had been the different offices that had shunted me around. But in spite of his airy-fairy persiflage and la-di-da manner, I felt that he was straight. "Okay, Chief," I said, "I confess. I robbed the bank, but I didn't shoot the cashier. That was Muggsy. You see, Chief, it was this way." Tyler sat back and heard me out from A to Z2 in the history of my last 2 weeks. "I can't expect you to believe me, Mr. Tyler," I concluded, "but I'd like to have it on record somewhere in this town that I had told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and all I get for it is an Order of Merit citation."
"You escape it," he cried. "My poor old bewildered Tompkins, of course I believe you. Stranger tales than yours have passed across my desk. I have served under one president who thought he was Jesus Christ, one who knew he was Jesus Christ, and two who were afraid the voters would realize that they were not Jesus Christ. I have seen 5 successive secretaries of state who had no doubt that they were God's vice-regent on earth. As for drawing a blank, Mr. Tompkins, that is no news to this department. What we diplomatic underlings fear is when our superiors fail to draw blanks. Why, I remember, but no matter."
"Then what would you do if you were me, Mr. Tyler?" I asked him. "I'm the innocent victim of the damnedest set of circumstances ever dreamed up." The red-headed young diplomat looked at me warily.
"The department, sir," he said, "does not answer hypothetical questions. What is good enough for the department is good enough for me."
"But here I find myself," I reminded him, "in high favor with the intelligence forces and with the reputation of a Don Juan in the bosoms of my family, and no idea how I got there."
Tyler chuckled. "I always knew they were plural," he said. "Think nothing of it. Stupider men than you have stood in far higher repute in this town, and the reputation of Don Juan is easily acquired. For all you know, you may be a perfectly sterling family man and quite devoid of political intelligence. How's that again?" "Just a figure of speech," Tyler answered airily. "Just the same, Mr. Tompkins, it would be interesting to know why you picked on Z2 and where you got your undoubted talent for brass-knuckled duplicity. As far as I can see, you've sold yourself as Z2 to all the brass hats, including the Kansas City lad who woke up to find himself president." "Again, in my own defense," I said, "I did it only because the FBI had a gun at my back and were going to give me the works if I didn't clear myself inside of 24 hours. I always thought," I added, "that in this country you were assumed innocent until proven guilty." Tyler winked wickedly. "There's a war on," he announced, "and doesn't the FBI know it?" I bade the diplomat goodbye and left the State Department with a sense of personal uneasiness. Who would have dreamed that there was a Z2 organization before I imagined it? If this kind of thing kept on happening, it mightn't be a bad idea to take a fling at the Hartford Sanctuary and have myself psyched by experts. "Beg pardon, sir, but are you Mr. Tompkins?"
The Hart, Schaffner, and Marks youngster who accosted me on the State Department steps had a definite bulge under his left shoulder that warned me that he was armed. "Yes, and who are you, sir?" I inquired.
"I'm Monahan from the Secret Service," he told me. "The chief wants to see you."
"And who is the chief?" I asked.
"Chief Flynn, of course," he said. "It's only a few steps over at the Treasury building."
"All right, Mr. Monahan," I agreed. "I'll come along quietly. Am I under arrest? Should I send for my lawyer?"
"The service don't go much for lawyers," he said. "This way, sir."
With Monahan at my elbow, I turned right on Pennsylvania Avenue and walked in front of the White House and turned down East Executive Avenue to the side entrance of the Treasury. A few baffling twists and turns in the corridors of Morgenthau, and I found myself in a large, sparsely furnished room facing a white-haired Irishman. "This is Tompkins, Chief," Monahan reported, and left me with the gimlet-eyed Secret Service executive. "You're W.S. Tompkins?" he asked me. "Yes, and who are you?" "My name's Flynn." Neither of us said anything for a couple of minutes. He was obviously waiting for me to ask him why I had been brought to him, so I deliberately kept silent, pulled out a cigarette and lighted it. Seeing no ashtray, I flicked the burnt match on the official green carpet and waited for him to open the conversation. "So you don't need to be told why you're here, Tompkins," he purred. "I came here, Mr. Flynn," I told him, "because one of your men practically put a gun in my ribs in front of the State Department. What do you want? A ticket to a prize fight? A good write-up in the papers? Tell me what it will cost me, and I'll pay, within reason. I didn't know that the Irish had got control of the Secret Service, or I would have mailed the money ahead. In cash, of course, no checks, all small bills not consecutively numbered." Flynn scowled out the window in the general direction of the White House. I dropped some more cigarette ash on the carpet. Suddenly he whirled to me. "We're here to protect the President," he snapped, "and we don't propose to take any lip from you." I said nothing. Then I noticed the flag over the White House at half-mast. "Why's that flag at half-mast, Mr. Flynn?" I asked. "Because the President's dead." "Was he murdered?" I asked. "He was not. He died of natural causes. But we don't go for people plotting to kill any president, even if he's dead. Our job depends on it." I rubbed out the stub of my cigarette on the corner of his mahogany desk and lighted another one. "Since Roosevelt wasn't murdered, what am I here for?" I asked. "I'm a perfectly respectable New York businessman. I'm registered at the Willard and my wife can identify me. I have plenty of other references if you need them. The FBI, say, or General Wakely in counterintelligence. If you have anything to ask me, I'll be glad to try to answer questions, but I'm damned if I propose to sit here and let myself be accused of something I never dreamed of doing." "And what are you going to do about it?" he asked. "Sue?" "Oh, I have no doubt that you can beat me up and send me to the hospital, but as soon as I'm out, I'll tell my story, and then I guess a man named Flynn will be looking for another job." Flynn smiled. "And why do you think the hospital will be letting you go, Mr. Tompkins? Of course, if it was only for a broken leg or a fractured skull, it wouldn't be easy. But what about St. Elizabeth's?" I raised my eyebrows. "Never heard of it," I said. "St. Elizabeth's," he explained, "is where we send people in Washington who aren't right in the head. We have a lot of alienists and psychiatrists there who can look you over, keep you under observation. They can hold you there as long as they like, because if there's any questions about a man's sanity, they would be failing in their duty if they let him go." "In other words, Mr. Flynn," I interrupted, "you threaten to send me to the local lunatic asylum if I raise any objection to your methods. Is that the game?" Flynn was on familiar ground here. "Mr. Tompkins," he asked me, "how's your health? You don't look any too good to me. Don't you think you'd be better for a little special care?" I laughed admiringly. "So that's your game, is it? Well, I never thought the Secret Service was reduced to blackmail. Okay, I'll pay." "Whoever mentioned pay?" Flynn was indignant. "Nuts," I replied. "Cops are all the same. They jail Capone for income tax because they can't convict him for being a racketeer. You think you're being cute by sending people to the booby hatch if you have no proof that they're dangerous. So go ahead. Send me to St. Elizabeth's. But don't think for 1 minute that I'm not on to the Irish." Flynn's face grew slowly and magnificently purple. "My God," he shouted. "What's the matter with Ireland, anyhow?" Ireland? Now he was on my ground. Too proud to fight the war for freedom. Ireland? To hell with Ireland. This is the United States of America. What has Ireland to do with your duty to the United States? Flynn slumped back in his chair, muttering. "Go," he said hoarsely. "Get out of here. Get out of this building. Get out of this town. By God Almighty, if I catch you here within the next 24 hours, I... Scratch a cop and find a four-flusher, I observed incautiously. You're still looking for Booth in Ford's Theater, and are figuring ways to guard Garfield in the Union Station. For all you know, Roosevelt may have been killed. But if he was, you know I had nothing to do with it. The record shows I'm one of the few people who tried to do anything about it. And you don't dare touch the man who told me. Who was that? Flynn demanded sullenly. Axel Roscommon, I said. Another Irishman. So you don't lay a finger on him. Roscommon, Flynn snorted. A black Protestant from Ulster. He is no Irishman. But I can't touch him as well, you know. The bloody British in the State Department are protecting him. So you take it out on me, huh? I suggested. Flynn drew himself up. See here, Mr. Tompkins, he said. I've told you to get out of Washington and stay out of Washington. In a job like mine, I have to follow my hunches. And my hunch is, if you aren't out of here by noon tomorrow, we'll send you over to St. Elizabeth's for observation. After all, we can't have people threatening the president. When did I ever threaten the president? Sure, and you did it just now, declared the chief. You used threatening and abusive language about the President of the United States within the meaning of the act, and the Secret Service is not going to stand for it. In other words, Mr. Flynn, I observed, you can't win against the cops. Anything to keep their job. Okay, I know when I'm licked. I'll leave town, and I'll even beat you to the booby hatch. If this is sanity, I want to be locked up. Chief Flynn hunched his shoulders and scowled at me. Yes, I told him. I'll check myself with the psychiatrists. Mr. Tompkins, Flynn remarked quietly, the more I see of you, the more I feel that you ought to have immediate medical attention. He lifted his telephone and began dialing a number. And won't that look swell on your record, I said, when President Truman gives me a citation for the Order of Merit the same day that Chief Flynn locks me up as a threat to the President. Oh! Flynn laid down the receiver and looked at me with dawning respect. Oh is right, I replied, and left the room. Nobody tried to stop me as I walked out of the Treasury, but I knew that I must take no more chances. From now on, it was a race to the alienists, and the best hope for continued liberty lay with my getting there first. I hailed a taxicab. Drive me to the Phipps Clinic, John Hopkins Hospital, I told the driver. Geez, Chief, that's in Baltimore. You are absolutely right, I told him, and it's $50 for you if you get me there inside the hour. I sank back on the cushions of the rear seat. I had come out of the Washington rat race worse off than when I entered it. Then it was merely a question of my liberty. After 3 days, it had become a matter of my sanity. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The white-coated medical man, he said he was associate psychiatrist at the Phipps Clinic, beckoned me to follow him into a side room. He waved me to be seated and closed the door. You see, Mr. Tompkins, he told me, everybody's crazy. There is no point in recounting the stages which had converted my panic flight from the wrath of the Secret Service into this interview with one of John Hopkins' psychiatric staff, except that I had been amazed by the ease with which he had drawn me aside shortly after I had sat down in the waiting room. Of course I realize, Doctor, I replied, that everyone must be abnormal, since that is how you establish an average normality. My case is so peculiar, though, that I'd like to have you check on me. Here we can take you only on the recommendation of a registered physician or psychiatrist, he told me. We're understaffed and overcrowded as it is. My advice to you would be to return to your home. You live near New York, you say? And put yourself in the hands of your regular family physician. There are plenty of institutions in your part of the country which are fully qualified to give the necessary treatment. Even if you were recommended to us now, we could only put you on the waiting list." I murmured something vague about war conditions and neurotics, but he raised his hand like a traffic cop and interrupted me. "The war, at least so far as active service is concerned, has taken a load off us, Mr. Tompkins," he informed me. "You see, in normal times, people live under any normal of pressures which force them to restrain their natural impulses. War gives them outlets, including sex, a sense of gang solidarity, and permission to commit acts of violence and homicide, which would result in jail sentences for them at other times. Of course, there are a good many psychos coming out of actual combat, but the government takes care of them. No, the bulk of our current cases are essential civilians, generals, administrators, politicians, business executives, who find that the war simply redoubles the pressures on them. Some of them are really insane in the medical sense, but their positions are so high that we dare not insist on their hospitalization. Instead, we have a simple prescription which most of them find no difficulty in taking. Perhaps it would help in your case." "What's that?" I asked. "Oh, just go out and get drunk now and then, and find yourself a girlfriend. Blow off steam, in other words. Find an outlet for your natural impulses. If the White House had consulted me, Roosevelt might still... Oh well, no use crying over spilt milk. Half the mental trouble in this country is due to people trying to be something they are not, and the other half is due to people trying not to be something that they naturally are. Primitive people are rarely troubled with neuroses." "But you said that everybody's crazy, doctor," I objected. "How does that fit into the picture?"
"Mr. Tompkins," the psychiatrist remarked, "you must have noticed that the only sane people today are the alleged lunatics who do what makes them happy. Take the man who thinks he is Napoleon. He is Napoleon, and is much happier than those who try to tell him that he isn't. The real maniacs are now in control of the asylum. There's a theory among the psychiatrists that certain forms of paranoia are contagious. Every now and then, a doctor or a nurse, here and at other mental clinics, goes what they call crazy and has to join the patients. My theory is that it is sanity which is contagious, and that the only sane people are those who have sense enough to be crazy. They are locked up at once for fear that others will go sane too. Now, take me. At that moment, 2 husky young men came in and led him away. After a short interval, one of them returned. "I'm sorry this happened, sir," he apologized. "Dr. Murdoch is a tragic case. He was formerly employed here, and every now and then he still manages to escape to one of our consultation rooms. He's quite harmless. What was he telling you?" "That the only sane people in the world were the lunatics," I said. The young man nodded. "Yes, that's his usual line. That's what got him committed in the first place. For my money, he's right, but he oughtn't to go around saying it. And what can we do for you?" I told him that the associate psychiatrist had advised me to put myself in the hands of my family doctor and had prescribed a dose of wine, women, and song as a method of restoring my mental balance. I was troubled by serious loss of memory, I said, and needed treatment. He nodded again. "Boy, when I finish my internship and start private practice, am I going to clean up in the upper brackets with that one. Murdoch's crazy to waste that on these people in Phipps. They can't follow his advice. This one is strictly for Park Avenue." I left the clinic, phoned the hotel in Washington from a pay booth in a corner drugstore, and told Germaine to join me at Pook's Hill. I said that I had had to leave Washington in a hurry and would explain when I saw her. I added that I'd just had a consultation at Johns Hopkins and had decided to take medical treatment. "I know one thing you don't need treatment for, your nerve," she replied and hung up on me. When I reached the house in Bedford Hills, I was welcomed by Mary Myrtle at the front door and by the loud barking of Ponto from my bedroom. Germaine had not yet returned.
"How's Ponto?" I asked the maid. "Oh, he's fine," she told me. "Just fine. He eats his food and sleeps regular and is just like he was." "Good. I'll take a look at him." I went upstairs and held my bedroom door ajar. "Hello, Ponto, old boy," I said, in the curious tone one uses towards dogs, children, and public men. "Here I am, back from Washington." He lay on my bed with ears pricked up, gazing at me intently. "Yes, Ponto," I continued, "I got the Order of Merit from President Truman himself and met all the big shots. So if you take a bite at me now, it will be sabotage." Ponto put his ears back and let his tongue dangle from the side of his mouth while his tail made a haze as it thumped delightedly on the pillow. If he hadn't been an animal, I would have said he was laughing. "There, old fella," I soothed him. He woofed affectionately, jumped to the floor, and stood beside me, panting and drooling. "Thank God you're well again, Ponto," I told him. "We can't have two loony people in this house. Now it's my turn to go to the vet's and be treated." Ponto's answer was to lick my hand convulsively and wag his tail and otherwise give a splendid impersonation of an affectionate friend of man whose beloved master had returned. So I took him downstairs with me and turned him out for a run on the lawn while I sat in my den and tried to get my thoughts in order. What worried me most was Virginia Rutherford's sudden change in manner. From having been definitely the woman scorned, angry, hurt, and hell-bent for revenge, she had adopted an air of friendly complicity the moment I had left the White House. This made no sense to me. Germaine was unchanged, but that was because she was a simple woman who was in the obvious process of falling in love with her own husband. Whatever I did would be all right with her, which was a great comfort, but not much help. Then, too, I was beginning to get uneasy at the increasing glibness and complexity of the lies I was telling. It was almost as though I were playing a part for which at some time I had once rehearsed. As Tyler had told me in the State Department, it would be interesting to know how I happened to invent the legendary Z2. There was the crunch of gravel as an automobile slowed to a stop outside, the click of a key in the lock, and then Germaine was in the den and in my arms, with all the etchings of ducks staring at her. "Winnie," she exclaimed, "you are the most unexpected person. I had the most awful time at the Willard after you phoned me. When I tried to pay the bill, they wouldn't take my check because my name wasn't Grant. In fact, I had to telephone that nice Mrs. Jacklin before I could find a bank that would give me the money. Then that Mr. Harcourt from the FBI came in and talked to me for the longest time. He seemed quite surprised when I told him you had gone to Johns Hopkins. Don't you feel well, dear?" "I never felt better," I assured her. "No, Jimmy, that was because somebody in the Secret Service got the idea I ought to be put in an asylum. It's a nasty little trick of theirs, I gather, to send a man to the booby bin for life if they don't like him but have no evidence against him. So I thought I'd play it smart and beat them to the punch. That's why I went to Baltimore, to get a mental checkup at the Phipps Clinic." "Did they... Are you all right?" she faltered. "I couldn't bear it if..." I laughed and gave her a good hug. "I'm all right," I told her. "They didn't have time to examine me, but gave me 2 bits of advice. First, I was to get Jerry Rutherford to handle my case. I guess you need political influence now to get yourself locked up. And then I was told that I ought to have more liquor and women in my life. It seems I'm getting in a rut." "Winnie!" "Uh-huh. They recommended it for curing highly inhibited cases like mine. I'm repressed or something." "It must be something," Germaine observed 15 minutes later. "Oh dear, I didn't even think whether the door was locked. I'm a sight. You don't act repressed to me." She turned her face towards me, her eyes laughing. "In any case, I'll have to see a doctor," I said. "And it might as well be Rutherford. He knows so much about me that I won't have to do a lot of explaining." "Winnie?" Germaine swung her feet to the floor and straightened her clothes. "Winnie," she repeated, Must you go to a doctor? Can't we try the other prescription? I mean, give it a good try?" I shook my head. "No can do. I've got to get my memory straightened out. You and I, well, we're all right now. But there's my business, and then there's the Secret Service. I can't seem to remember a thing before the 2nd of April, and I did so much lying in Washington trying to cover up that I may get into real trouble. That's what Virginia said, that I'd lied myself into a worse mess than I'd lied myself out of." My wife pouted. "Don't those treatments take a long time?" she asked. "I remember when they sent Cousin Frederick to the asylum after that time when he put tear gas in the air conditioners in the stock exchange. It was 3 years before they let him out. Of course, he was crazy, though we pretended it was only drink. That time he tried to tattoo the little Masters girl. But won't they keep you locked up and do things to you?" "Hanged if I know," I said. "But they can't keep me there a day longer than you or I want. It isn't as though I was being committed to an asylum. It's just that there's a bad crack in my memory. They'll try to find out what's wrong and patch it up. Perhaps I won't have to stay after all. Do they let wives come and visit their husbands?" she asked dreamily. "I mean, I've never heard that the medical profession encouraged that kind of therapy," I told her. "Speaking of insanity," I continued, "Ponto, you will be glad to know, is back to normal." She got up and made a face at me. "Of course," she remarked with deliberate provocation, "if you think more of Ponto than you do of me. I'm so glad, Winnie, to know that Ponto is better. He's your dog, isn't he? What was wrong with him? What medicine did you give him? What did the vet say?" She ended in a startled squeak and ran for the door. "You beast!" she exclaimed, turning on me. "It was locked all the time. Oh, Winnie." 1,000 years later, she said once more, "Oh, Winnie." Then she laughed. "Just the same," she said, "I'm glad about Ponto. I still think I don't like the way he's been acting." She yawned. "And now, sir," she added, "will you please let me go to my room? I'm still rather dirty from my trip, and I ought to get a few things unpacked. And besides," she laughed again, "I'm ravenously hungry." "So am I remarked truthfully. "But I know we're both crazy," she told me some time later, "and perhaps they'd better give us a double room at the asylum. But I know that unless I eat something right away, I'll be dead in the morning." "Let me see if there's anything in the icebox," I said. "Mary's probably given up dinner long ago." "Her name is Myrtle," Germaine corrected me. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dr. Rutherford's office was tastefully furnished in the suburban medical manner to suggest a Tudor tap room. There was, of course, a spotless chrome and porcelain laboratory connecting, as well as an equally sanitary lavatory. "Good of you to squeeze me in, Jerry," I remarked to Rutherford. "Fact is, I need your professional opinion." Rutherford stroked his little dab of a mustache. "I've sent in my application to the Army Medical Corps," he told me. "I hoped you'd come to straighten out the money end." "That will be taken care of any time you need it," I assured him. "Miss Briggs at my office will have full details. I'll phone her and my lawyer to fix it up as soon as I get back to the house." "Well, what seems to be wrong with you, old man?" he inquired. "War getting too much for you? Got a hangover? Need vitamins? Bowels regular? I must say, you've got a better color and have lost weight since the last time I saw you." "It's nothing wrong with my body. And I have lost weight," I explained. "It's my mind. I've had a complete loss of memory as to what happened before April 2nd. In Washington, I was lucky to avoid the booby hatch. They couldn't handle me at Hopkins, so they told me to consult my family physician. I guess that means that you were elected." Family physician is good, Rutherford remarked with a rather unprofessional grin.
But hell, I'm no psychiatrist. Of course, in practice around here, I bump into a few psychopathic cases, but I must say you've never struck me as the type.
I assured him that I was in dead earnest about this matter, that I must somehow get myself certified as sane or I might be in trouble with the government.
Rot, my dear fellow, Rutherford assured me. You've had some kind of psychic trauma or shock that's resulted in temporary amnesia. That could happen to anybody. You're as sane as I am.
I asked him whether he'd be willing to sign a medical certificate to that effect.
Well, he replied slowly, that's another story. I'm not a specialist along psychiatric lines. Up here I get mostly baby cases, indigestion, some alcoholism, and now and then, thank God, a real honest broken leg. My name on a certificate wouldn't mean much in sanity proceedings. I'd rather have you run over to Hartford and see Dr. Folsom at the sanctuary. He has the stuff and the equipment to put you through the standard tests.
That's okay by me, Jerry, I agreed, but I'd still like you to put me through a few paces so that your records will show that this is on the level. If some bright boy in Washington decides to throw me in the asylum for making nasty faces at the big brass, I want to have a clean medical record for use in a countersuit for false arrest. Rutherford stood up and looked out the window.
I'm a hell of a poor choice for a man to look into your private life after this business with Germaine in Virginia, he observed.
That's why I want to keep it all in the family, I told him. Listen, Jerry, until she came out to Pook's Hill the other day, I have no recollection of ever setting eyes on Virginia. Under the circumstances, she's as superfluous as a bridegroom's pajamas. I faked as well as I could, but the plain fact is that I have no memory of her, of you, of Jimmy, or anybody around here before April 2nd. Now that's not normal, to put it mildly.
You know, Winnie, the doctor remarked professionally, I think that your, quote, loss of memory, unquote, is nothing but a defense mechanism. I know a bit about your affairs, and they seem to have got so complicated, with 3 or 4 women on a string, business problems, liquor, and so forth, that you simply decided subconsciously not to remember anything about them. Your mind's a blank as to everything you want to forget.
I shook my head. The trouble is, Jerry, that my mind's not blank at all. I remember a hell of a lot, but it's all about another man.
How's that again?
So I told him the whole story from beginning to end, skipping only the bits about the thorium bomb and Z2 for reasons of security, and omitting the name of the carrier. He took notes and studied them for a while. Then he looked up at me and smiled.
This beats anything in Freud, he observed. I still stick to my off-the-cuff diagnosis that you had something that gave you a shock. It needn't have been anything big, you know, just a straw that broke the camel's back, and then developed this loss of memory as a defense mechanism. And this transfer of personalities with Jacqueline, metempsychosis is the fancy word for it, is not the usual type of schizophrenia, but it falls into a pattern of wish fulfillment. You probably don't remember it, but ever since I've known you, you've been grousing about this fellow Jacqueline, whom none of us have ever met. It's been close to an obsession with you. I gather that you had some kind of a schoolboy crush on him which he ignored, and your feelings turned to hatred. You seem to have kept close track of him and his doings all these years. Subconsciously, you must have identified yourself with him. I'm just guessing now. Folsom could make a scientific check. But I should say that you may have developed a split personality based on envy and jealousy for this chap. Jacqueline's had to make his own way, while you've always had plenty of money and good business connections, especially since you got over the Depression. He was in uniform serving his country, and you were a civilian enriching yourself. He had separated from his wife, while you were tangled up with a lot of women. But how did I know that Mrs. Jacqueline had a mole on her left hip? I asked. 9 women out of 10 have at least one, and often more moles on both their hips, he said. As you should know. In any case, I take it that you didn't verify the statement. No, Winnie, at the sanctuary they can deal with this sort of thing scientifically and tell you how to make a readjustment.
My wife doesn't want me to readjust too much, I told him. She'd rather have me crazy and stick around with her than sane but off chasing a bunch of skirts. Can't say that I blame her, old man, he agreed, controlling himself with a visible effort. But that's her affair and nothing to do with your case. Quite, I told him. And let me say that you've been a hell of a good sport about this mess. Believe me, Jerry, I'm not trying to alibi myself so far as Virginia is involved, but I don't remember anything about her and me that couldn't be taught in a Methodist Sunday school. It's almost as though I had been born again, given a last chance to relive my life. If that's what trauma does for you, we ought to have more of it. Listen, Winnie, the doctor remarked. This is between us, of course. But the sanest thing you ever did was to get shed of Virginia. She's fun and all that, but after a few weeks, it's boring to live with a one-track mind with red hair. Germaine is worth a dozen of her. Perhaps when I get back from the army, Virginia will have settled down enough to be a doctor's wife. You'll see that she gets the money, won't you? Sure, I agreed. And I'll give you a tip I learned at Hopkins. The shortcut to medical riches. A loony psychiatrist there says he always advises middle-aged men to do a little heavy drinking and woman chasing in order to get rid of their inhibitions. There ought to be a fortune in that kind of medical treatment, especially in Westchester. Jerry Rutherford laughed. Westchester's discovered the prescription all by itself, he said. And they're just beginning to learn that when a middle-aged American sheds his inhibitions, there's damn little of him left. Now, you better run along and get packed for a stay in Hartford. I'll phone Folsom and tell him you're driving over this afternoon. He'll fix you up if anyone can. Swell, I thanked him. When I got back to Pook's Hill, I called the office and told Arthurjean that I was leaving for a rest cure at the Hartford Sanctuary and to tell my partners that I didn't want to be disturbed by business affairs until further notice. I asked her to get hold of Meriwether Vale and meet me at the sanctuary as soon as they could make it. They were to bring the necessary papers so that I could deed over $15,000 to Dr. Jeremiah Rutherford of Bedford Hills to be paid in monthly installments of $1,000 to his wife. I added that there was nothing seriously wrong with me, but that the best advice I could get recommended a rest cure to head off a possible nervous breakdown. Then I said goodbye to Germaine, gave Ponto a farewell pat on the head, and piled into my Packard for the drive to Hartford. The sanctuary proved to be a large, pleasant brick building, something about halfway between a country club and a summer hotel, in the better-groomed suburbs of Hartford, with a fine view of the Connecticut River. The ample grounds were surrounded by a high-spiked iron fence, and the gates to the driveway were closed until I had identified myself to the guard on duty. In fact, it reminded me of the routine of getting admitted to the White House grounds, except that this time I was not accompanied by General Wakely. At the front door, a uniformed attendant took charge of my bags and gave directions to have my car sent to the garage. Then I was ushered into one of those hospital waiting rooms that defy all interior decorating efforts to give them a respectable home-like touch. A few moments later, a pretty nurse in a white starched uniform directed me to follow her. We went through a door, which she was careful to lock behind her, along a corridor, and up one flight of stairs to a pleasantly furnished bedroom where my bags were already waiting for me. She told me to get undressed and go to bed, which I did, after she had carefully unpacked my belongings, removing my razor and my nail file. "Dr. Folsom will be by to see you in a few minutes, Mr. Tompkins," she informed me. "Just ring if you want anything." After she left, I felt good and mad. How in blazes did they expect to minister to a mind diseased if they began by the old routine of getting the patient stripped and bedded? Then I realized that this was just a simple matter of establishing the institution's moral superiority at the very outset, and my anger evaporated. I lay back and dozed for a few minutes until the door opened and a burly man with a glittering eye and strangler's hands entered my room. "I'm Dr. Folsom, Mr. Tompkins," he informed me. "Dr. Rutherford phoned that you were coming over for a checkup. Before we get down to business, there are a few routine questions I'd like to ask." They were routine. Name, age, address, next of kin, annual income, banking connections, name of recommending physician, and whether patient had previously received mental treatment in an accredited psychiatric institution. "Shall we mail the bills to Mrs. Tompkins?" he asked. "Hell no, give them to me. I brought along my checkbook." Dr. Folsom nodded approval. "Here is the bill for the first week," he said. "We generally ask our patients to pay in advance." He handed me a folded piece of fine bonded paper. On it, tastefully inscribed, was the information that I owed the Sanctuary, Hartford, Connecticut, $250 for room, board, and attendance for the period of April 20th to 25th, inclusive. There was a space for my signature, and the doctor thrust a fountain pen into my hand. "Just sign there, and we'll send it to your bank for collection," he said. "What's all this fine print?" I suddenly demanded. "Oh, that's just a matter of form," he explained. "Wait a minute," I urged. "I was always taught that when in Hartford, you ought always to read the small print at the bottom of the page." I studied it out. The above signature, it read, "constitutes an agreement not to leave or attempt to leave the Sanctuary without the prior approval of the management." I looked at Dr. Folsom. "If you don't mind, Doctor," I told him, "I'd prefer to sign one of my own checks and have it cleared in the usual way. What's the idea of having me sign away my liberty like that?" Folsom smiled disarmingly. "That's one of the ways we judge whether a patient is really sane. Only a crazy man would sign it," he explained. "More seriously, Mr. Tompkins, you must remember that a private asylum has quite a problem in controlling its patients. They are not generally committed to our care by court orders, and usually come here only at the request of their families with their own reluctant consent. Without a signed agreement of that kind, we might be exposed to legal annoyances, suit for damages, or even a kidnapping charge if a patient changed his mind and decided to act nasty." "I see your point, Doctor," I told him. "I've asked my attorney and my private secretary to meet me here a little later today. I have some business I must clean up before I can settle down for treatment. I'll consult him about the kind of agreement to sign with the Sanctuary. So far as I'm concerned, I don't see the necessity for any agreement. I want to get a simple sanity test to see if you can recommend any course of treatment for dealing with a serious loss of memory." "I'm not sure that it is the management's policy to accept the patient under such unusual conditions," he said. "I'll have to consult my associates." "See here, Doctor," I replied. "All I want now is to have one of the psychiatrists give me the works, tell me whether I'm sane or crazy, and then I'll pull out. I don't want to stay here under false pretenses, and I don't intend to stay here a minute longer than I want to. I'll pay any fee you charge within reason. But I'm damned if I'll sign my own freedom away, with Wall Street getting set to shoot the works." Dr. Folsom laughed. "I can't say I blame you, Mr. Tompkins. And you don't sound unbalanced to me." "But I want a document signed to that effect," I declared. "You see, some of my business associates have been trying to have me adjudged incompetent so as to get control of my money. It's about $3 million at present quotations. So I'm out to build up my defenses in advance of the showdown. Now do you understand?" "Oh!" The director of the Sanctuary was enormously relieved. "That's no trouble at all. I'll send up our business psychiatrist, Dr. Pendergast Potter. He studied under Jung in Vienna, you know. And he'll give you our standard businessman's sanity test. We have quite a few cases like yours, you know. It's surprising how many business partners seize on insanity as a key to robbing their associates. It's done every day. And our fee for this service will be $5,000. $5,000 it is," I agreed. "Good," Dr. Folsom beamed. "I'll send Potter over right away." End of chapter 23.